Hello, my dear sleepy listener. Welcome to Sleepy Crown, where history's quiet tales gently carry you into dreamland. Tonight, we embark on a peaceful journey through the extraordinary life of Rædwald, the East Anglian overlord who balanced two worlds and was buried like a king of kings. We'll softly explore the rise of a ruler who kept altars to both Christ and ancient gods, who defeated mighty kings and shaped the destiny of early England, and whose magnificent burial at Sutton who remains one of archaeology's greatest treasures, while the gentle rhythms of 7th century East Anglia lull you into restful sleep. Before you drift away into peaceful slumber, please take a moment to like this video. Your support means the world to our growing Sleepy Crown family. And don't be shy about leaving a gentle comment below. Whether you share a favorite moment from tonight's tale, your thoughts on Rædwald's fascinating religious duality, or simply say hello from wherever you're listening, we love hearing from each of you. Your comments create our cozy community of history lovers, and every single one brings a smile to our faces. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to keep these soothing historical tales coming your way. We have so many more gentle stories from the past waiting to carry you to peaceful dreams. So cozy up, close your eyes, and let these gentle whispers from 7th century East Anglia carry you toward restful sleep. If you're new here, welcome to the Sleepy Crown family. Rædwald, later known as the Bretwalda of East Anglia and the King of Kings, entered this world during the twilight years of the 6th century, when the very fabric of Britain was being rewoven by Germanic hands. Born sometime between 560 and 580, he emerged into a realm where ancient gods still walked in the shadows of sacred groves, where the thunder of Thor's hammer echoed across misty fenlands, and where the whispered wisdom of Woden carried on every evening breeze. His birthplace was the kingdom of East Anglia, a land that seemed touched by magic itself, stretching across what we now know as Norfolk and Suffolk. This realm was a world apart from the rest of early England. To the west lay the great fenlands, vast expanses of marsh and water that formed a natural barrier as formidable as any Roman. While these wetlands, shrouded in perpetual mist and populated by creatures both real and mythical, created an island kingdom where traditions could flourish undisturbed by the changing tides of the outside world. The East Anglia of Rædwald. Youth was a land where every sunrise painted the sky in shades of gold and amber, where ancient burial mounds dotted the landscape like sleeping giants, and where the cries of seabirds mingled with the songs of bards in royal halls. Here, along the banks of rivers like the Deben and the Yare, settlements had grown rich from trade with distant lands. Ships bearing precious cargo from Scandinavia, the Rhineland, and even the far-off Byzantine Empire regularly navigated these waterways, bringing with them not just goods, but stories, ideas, and glimpses of the wider world beyond the marshes. Into this enchanted realm was born a prince, destined for greatness. Rædwald's father, Titila, ruled over this kingdom with the wisdom that came from understanding both the old ways and the new currents flowing across the known world. Titila was a king in the truest sense, not merely a war leader who had seized power through strength of arms, but a ruler who embodied the connection between his people and the land they inhabited. Under his reign, East Anglia had grown prosperous and secure, its borders protected by both natural barriers and the fierce loyalty of warriors who fought not just for gold and glory, but for the very soil of their ancestors. The royal family, into which Rædwald was born, traced its lineage back through the mists of time to Wulfar, the semi-legendary founder of their dynasty. The Wulfingers, as they came to be known, claimed descent from none other than Woden himself, the the Allfather, the one-eyed god of war, wisdom, and magic who ruled over the Germanic pantheon. This divine ancestry was no mere boast or political convenience. It was a sacred truth that shaped every aspect of royal life and governance. The kings of East Anglia were not merely earthly rulers, but living bridges between the world of men and the realm of the gods. Young Rædwald grew up in halls where golden arm rings caught the firelight and threw dancing shadows on carved wooden pillars. The walls of his father's palace were hung with tapestries that told the stories of heroes who had crossed the whale road from their Scandinavian homeland, of warriors who had fought monsters and won kingdoms, of wise kings who had ruled justly and been rewarded with eternal fame. The very air seemed thick with history and legend, with the weight of ancestral expectations and the promise of future glory. From his earliest years, Rædwald was shaped by the dual nature of his heritage. On one hand, he was heir to the fierce warrior traditions of his Germanic ancestors, men who valued courage above all else, who believed that a hero's deeds would echo in the songs of bards long after his bones had turned to dust. These were people who faced death without fear, knowing that the brave would feast forever in Woden's hall of Valhalla. On the other hand, he was also heir to a growing sophistication that came from East Anglia's position as a crossroads of international trade and culture. The young prince learned early that kingship was about more than just leading warriors into battle. Though martial prowess remained essential, a true king had to be a ring-giver, generous to his followers, wise in his judgments, and skillful in the delicate art of diplomacy. He had to understand the sacred rituals that maintained the favor of the gods, the legal traditions that governed disputes between his subjects, and the economic forces that brought prosperity to his realm. Rædwald's education was comprehensive, as befitted a future king. He learned to wield sword and spear with deadly efficiency, to ride a horse in battle, and to lead men in the shield wall, where courage and leadership could mean the difference between victory and catastrophe. But he also learned the more subtle arts of kingship, how to judge disputes fairly, how to manage the complex web of relationships between nobles and commoners, and how to read the signs that might indicate divine favor or displeasure. The court of his father was a place where tradition and innovation existed side by side. Here, shops the royal bards sang ancient songs that preserved the memory of heroes from the homeland across the North Sea. They told of Beowulf and his battles with monsters, of the tragic fall of kings and the rise of dynasties, of the eternal struggle between order and chaos that defined the human condition. Yet this same court also welcomed merchants from distant lands, who brought not just exotic goods, but news of the wider world, tales of the great Byzantine Empire with its golden city of Constantinople, of the Frankish kingdoms that were growing ever more powerful, and of a new religion that was spreading across Europe with remarkable speed. As Rædwald grew from boy to young man, he began to understand that he lived at a crucial moment in history. The old certainties were crumbling. The old gods seemed increasingly distant as a new faith proclaimed a different kind of salvation. Yet this was also a time of unprecedented opportunity for those wise enough to navigate the changing currents of belief and politics. His younger brother, Eni, was his constant companion in these formative years, and together they learned the skills that would be essential in the dangerous world of Anglo-Saxon politics. They practiced with weapons until their arms ached, studied the genealogies that traced their family's divine descent, and listened carefully to the deliberations of their father's council, absorbing the wisdom of experienced warriors and advisors. But, perhaps most importantly, Rædwald learned to think strategically about power, how to acquire it, how to maintain it, and how to use it effectively. he observed how his father balanced the competing interests of different nobles, how he managed relationships with neighboring kingdoms, and how he used both generosity and firmness to maintain order within his realm. These lessons would prove invaluable in the challenges that lay ahead. The East Anglia of Rædwald's youth was not just a kingdom but a cultural treasure house. The royal workshops produced some of the finest metalwork in all of Europe, intricate brooches decorated with garnets and gold, magnificent buckles that served as symbols of rank and authority, and weapons whose beauty was matched only by their deadly efficiency. The royal treasure house contained artifacts from across the known world: Roman silver, Frankish jewelry, Byzantine silk, and amber from the distant Baltic shores. This wealth was not accumulated merely for display, but served important political and social functions. A king's generosity to his followers was one of the fundamental bonds that held Anglo-Saxon society together. Warriors expected to be rewarded for their loyalty with gifts of precious objects, and kings who failed to fulfill this obligation quickly found themselves without supporters. The art of gift-giving was a delicate one that required understanding, not just the value of objects, but their symbolic significance and the complex web of relationships within the royal court. As Rædwald approached adulthood, the political situation across Anglo-Saxon England was becoming increasingly complex. The 7 major kingdoms, Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria, East Anglia, Essex, Kent, and Sussex, were locked in an intricate dance of alliance and warfare that constantly reshuffled the balance of power. At any given moment, some kingdoms were ascendant, while others were in decline, and a ruler's survival often depended on his ability to read these shifting patterns and position himself advantageously to the south. The Kingdom of Kent was emerging as a major power under King Æthelfrith, who had married a Christian Frankish princess and was developing increasingly close ties with the continent. To the west, the Kingdom of Mercia was beginning its own rise to prominence, while to the north, the 2 Northumbrian kingdoms of Deira and Bernicia were locked in their own struggle for supremacy. In this complex environment, East Anglia's position was both advantageous and precarious, wealthy enough to be an attractive ally or target, but not yet powerful enough to dictate terms to its neighbors. The religious landscape was equally complex. While most Anglo-Saxon kingdoms still followed the traditional Germanic religion of their ancestors, winds of change were beginning to blow across the landscape. Christian missionaries from Rome and Ireland were making their presence felt, and some kings were beginning to consider the advantages that conversion might bring. The new faith offered not just spiritual salvation, but also political and diplomatic benefits: closer ties with Christian kingdoms on the continent, access to the sophisticated administrative systems developed by the Roman Church, and the possibility of legitimacy in the eyes of powerful Christian rulers. For young Rædwald, watching these developments from his father's court, it was becoming clear that the next generation of Anglo-Saxon rulers would face choices that their ancestors could never have imagined. The old ways that had served the Germanic peoples for centuries were being challenged by new ideas and new possibilities. Success would require not just the traditional virtues of courage and loyalty, but also adaptability, diplomatic skill, and the wisdom to know when to embrace change and when to hold fast to tradition. The final years of Tytila's reign were marked by increasing prosperity and stability. Trade flourished, the kingdom's borders remained secure, and the internal peace that had characterized his rule continued unbroken. Yet, beneath this surface calm, everyone could sense that momentous changes were approaching. The world that had given birth to the Wulfingers dynasty was passing away, and a new age was dawning in age. that would demand different skills and different approaches to the art of kingship. When Attila died, sometime around 599, he left behind a kingdom that was strong, prosperous, and well-positioned to play a major role in the events that would shape the future of England. More importantly, he left behind a son who had been carefully prepared for the challenges that lay ahead. Rædwald inherited not just a crown, but a legacy of wise governance, a treasury full of treasures, a warrior band of proven loyalty, and the accumulated wisdom of a dynasty that traced its origins to the gods themselves. As the young king took his place on the throne of East Anglia, few could have predicted just how profoundly he would shape the destiny of early England. The boy who had grown up listening to ancient songs would become a king whose own deeds would be worthy of the bards. The prince who had learned to balance tradition and innovation would become a ruler who successfully navigated one of the most complex political and religious transformations in English history. But all of that lay in the future. For now, in the closing years of the 6th century, King Rædwald began his reign as many young kings before him had done, with ceremonies that honored both his ancestors and the gods who watched over his people, with oaths of loyalty from his nobles and warriors, and with the quiet confidence that comes from thorough preparation and divine favor. The stage was set for one of the most remarkable reigns in Anglo-Saxon history, a reign that would see East Anglia rise to unprecedented heights of power and influence, a reign that would skillfully balance the competing demands of old gods and new faith, and a reign that would end with one of the most magnificent burials ever discovered by archaeologists. The boy had become a king. Now it remained to be seen what kind of legend he would become. As the dawn of the 7th century painted the East Anglian sky in shades of gold and crimson, King Rædwald faced the first great test of his reign, the world into which he had inherited. The throne was one of constant flux, where the balance of power could shift overnight, and where survival often depended on a ruler's ability to adapt quickly to changing circumstances. The young king, now in his 20s, and possessed of both the wisdom inherited from his father and the vigor of youth, was determined not merely to maintain his kingdom's position, but to elevate it to heights of power and influence that previous generations could barely have imagined. The England of 600 was a patchwork of competing kingdoms, each jealously guarding its independence while constantly seeking opportunities to expand at their neighbors' expense. This was the age of the Heptarchy, 7 major Anglo-Saxon kingdoms that dominated the political landscape. Wessex controlled much of the southwest, its kings tracing their lineage back to the legendary Cerdic and claiming dominion over vast stretches of fertile downland. Mercia was beginning its rise in the Midlands, its ambitious rulers eyeing the wealth of neighboring kingdoms with unconcealed desire. Northumbria, formed from the union of Dara and Bernicia, controlled the wild lands beyond the Humber, its warriors hardened by constant warfare against British kingdoms that still resisted Anglo-Saxon rule. Kent, under the rule of Æthelfrith, had achieved a position of particular prominence through its close connections with the Frankish kingdoms across the Channel. Essex controlled the lands around the Thames estuary, while Sussex held the coastal regions of the south. Each of these kingdoms had its own ambitions, its own alliances, and its own vision of what the future of England might hold. In this complex political environment, East Anglia occupied a unique position. Geographically, it was somewhat isolated from the main centres of Anglo-Saxon power by the great fenlands that stretched inland from the Wash. These marshes, while providing a natural defence against invasion, also limited the kingdom's ability to project power westward into the heart of England. Yet this apparent disadvantage was offset by other factors that made East Anglia a formidable player in the game of kingdoms. The wealth of East Anglia was legendary throughout the Anglo-Saxon world. The kingdom's position on the eastern coast made it a natural gateway for trade with Scandinavia and the continent. Ships bearing amber from the Baltic, furs from the northern forests, and luxury goods from as far away as the Black Sea regularly docked at East Anglian ports. The kingdom's craftsmen were renowned for their skill in working precious metals, creating jewelry and decorative objects that were coveted by nobles throughout England and beyond. This wealth gave Rædwald resources that many of his contemporaries could only dream of possessing. Gold and silver filled his treasure chambers, providing him with the means to reward loyal followers and attract new allies. The finest weapons and armor money could buy equipped his warriors, while his own person was adorned with regalia that proclaimed his status to all who looked upon him. Yet Rædwald understood that wealth alone was not enough to secure lasting power in the dangerous world of Anglo-Saxon politics. The new king quickly demonstrated that he possessed the military skills necessary to defend and expand his kingdom. The warrior band that served as his personal retinue was trained to the highest standards. Their loyalty secured not just by generous gifts, but by the knowledge that they served a king who would lead them to victory and glory. These men, drawn from the finest families of East Anglia, formed the core of Rædwald's military power and elite force, capable of striking swiftly and decisively against any threat to the kingdom. But Rædwald's genius lay not just in his ability to wage war, but in his understanding of when warfare was the right tool and when other approaches might prove more effective. The early years of his reign were marked by a careful campaign to strengthen East Anglia's position through a combination of military demonstration, diplomatic maneuvering, and strategic alliance building. One of his first significant actions as king was to solidify control over the coastal regions that were so vital to East Anglia's prosperity. The ports that handled the kingdom's lucrative trade needed to be secure from both pirate raids and the interference of rival kingdoms. Rædwald personally led expeditions to eliminate bandit strongholds that had been preying on merchant vessels, sending a clear message that the new king would tolerate no threats to his kingdom's economic lifelines. These campaigns served multiple purposes beyond their immediate military objectives. They provided opportunities for young warriors to prove themselves in battle, strengthening the bonds between the king and his followers through shared danger and shared victory. They also demonstrated to both allies and enemies that East Anglia, under its new king, was not a realm to be trifled with. The swift and decisive nature of these operations sent ripples throughout the Anglo-Saxon world, marking Rædwald as a ruler to be taken seriously. The king's approach to governance reflected the sophisticated political culture that had developed in East Anglia over the preceding generations. Unlike some of his contemporaries who ruled through fear and intimidation, Rædwald understood that lasting power required the consent and active support of his people. He maintained the traditional assemblies where free men could voice their concerns and participate in important decisions. He ensured that justice was administered fairly and in accordance with ancient custom, earning him a reputation for wisdom that extended far beyond his kingdom's borders. The royal court that Rædwald established became a center of culture and learning that attracted visitors from across the Anglo-Saxon world and beyond. Bards and storytellers found generous patronage at his hall, ensuring that the finest oral literature of the age was preserved and transmitted to future generations. Craftsmen working in precious metals, wood, and textiles produced objects of such beauty and sophistication that they became sought-after diplomatic gifts and symbols of East Anglian excellence. This cultural flowering was not merely an expression of royal magnificence, but served important political purposes. A king who could demonstrate his civilization and sophistication through the quality of his court attracted allies and discouraged potential enemies. Foreign ambassadors who witnessed the wealth and culture of Rædwald's court carried back reports that enhanced East Anglia's reputation and opened new opportunities for beneficial alliances. The religious life of the kingdom during these early years of Rædwald's reign remained firmly rooted in the traditional beliefs of the Anglo-Saxon people. The king himself served as high priest in the ancient ceremonies that marked the turning of the seasons, and sought the favor of the gods for his people. Sacred groves where the gods were thought to dwell were maintained with careful attention to ancestral practice, while royal ceremonies followed rituals that had been passed down through generations of Woofinger kings. Yet even in these early years, signs of the changes that would later transform the religious landscape of England were beginning to appear. Christian missionaries from Ireland and the continent were making their presence felt in neighboring kingdoms, and news of royal conversions was beginning to filter through the networks of trade and diplomacy that connected the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Rædwald, ever alert to political developments that might affect his realm, followed these religious changes with keen interest, recognizing that they represented both potential opportunities and potential threats. The king's personal magnetism and political skill began to attract followers from beyond the borders of East Anglia itself, younger sons of noble families from other kingdoms, seeking opportunities for advancement that might not be available in their homelands, made their way to Rædwald's court. Merchants and craftsmen established themselves in East Anglian towns, drawn by the prosperity and security that the kingdom offered. Even some nobles who had fallen out of favor with their own kings found refuge and new opportunities in Rædwald's service. This influx of talent and ambition strengthened East Anglia in numerous ways. The kingdom's military forces were enhanced by the addition of experienced warriors from other regions, while its diplomatic capabilities were expanded by advisors who possessed intimate knowledge of conditions in neighboring realms. The cultural and intellectual life of the court was enriched by the diverse perspectives and experiences that these newcomers brought with them. As Rædwald's reputation grew, so too did the respect accorded to him by his fellow kings. What had begun as a local East Anglian ruler was gradually being recognized as a major player on the wider stage of Anglo-Saxon politics. Embassies from other kingdoms began to arrive at his court with increasing frequency, seeking alliances, negotiating trade agreements, or simply paying their respects to a king whose power and influence were clearly on the rise. The wealth and stability of East Anglia during these years provided Rædwald with resources that his predecessors could never have imagined possessing. Trade revenues continued to grow as the kingdom's reputation for security and fair dealing attracted ever more merchants. The royal workshops produced luxury goods that were in demand throughout the known world, while East Anglian ships carried trade goods and diplomatic missions to distant ports. This growing prosperity allowed Rædwald to maintain what was arguably the finest warrior band in all of Anglo-Saxon England. His personal retinue was equipped with the best weapons and armor that money could buy. Their loyalty secured not just by material rewards, but by the knowledge that they served a king who would lead them to glory. The ceremonial aspects of royal life became increasingly elaborate, with court rituals and public ceremonies designed to demonstrate the divine favor that rested upon the Woofinger dynasty. Yet for all his growing power and influence, Rædwald understood that his position remained fundamentally dependent on his ability to navigate the complex and ever-changing relationships between the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. The balance of power that had seemed relatively stable at the beginning of his reign was showing signs of strain as ambitious rulers in other kingdoms began to challenge the existing order. To the south, Æthelfrith of Kent was becoming increasingly powerful, his marriage to a Frankish princess having opened new possibilities for continental alliances. To the west, the kingdom of Mercia was beginning to flex its muscles under rulers who harbored ambitions for expansion. Most ominously, to the north, the two kingdoms of Deira and Bernicia were moving toward a union that would create a Northumbrian superpower capable of challenging any kingdom in England. In this environment of growing tension and shifting alliances, Rædwald's skill as a diplomat became as important as his reputation as a warrior. He cultivated relationships with rulers who might serve as useful allies while carefully avoiding commitments that might drag East Anglia into conflicts that served no vital interest of the kingdom. His court became a center for the exchange of information, with merchants, pilgrims, and diplomatic messengers providing a constant stream of intelligence about developments throughout the Anglo-Saxon world. The king's personal qualities, intelligence, his charisma, and his reputation for keeping his word made him an attractive ally for rulers who were looking for reliable partners in an uncertain world. At the same time, his growing military reputation served as a deterrent to potential enemies who might otherwise have been tempted to test East Anglia's defences. As the first decade of the 7th century progressed, it became increasingly clear that Rædwald was emerging as one of the most significant rulers of his generation. The kingdom he had inherited from his father had been prosperous and secure, but under his leadership it was becoming something more, a major power that commanded respect throughout the Anglo-Saxon world and beyond. Yet even as his star continued to rise, Rædwald remained acutely aware that the world around him was changing in fundamental ways. The old certainties that had guided previous generations of kings were being challenged by new ideas, new technologies, and new forms of political organization. The most significant of these changes was the gradual spread of Christianity, which was beginning to transform not just individual kingdoms, but the entire framework within which Anglo-Saxon politics operated. The time was approaching when Rædwald would have to make some of the most important decisions of his reign, decisions that would determine not just his own fate, but the future direction of his kingdom and his dynasty. The young warrior who had successfully established himself as one of the most powerful rulers in England was about to face challenges that would test not just his military and diplomatic skills, but his wisdom, his adaptability, and his understanding of the fundamental forces that were reshaping the world in which he lived. The stage was being set for the next great phase of Rædwald's reign, a phase that would see him navigate the treacherous waters of religious transformation while simultaneously achieving the pinnacle of political power and influence. The warrior king who had proven his ability to fight and win was about to demonstrate that he possessed an even rarer quality than wisdom to know when fighting was not enough, and when success required embracing change while remaining true to the essential values that had made him great. In the gentle mists of early morning, as the East Anglian countryside awakened to another day of peace and prosperity, King Rædwald stood in the most remarkable structure ever built by an Anglo-Saxon ruler temple containing two altars, one dedicated to Christ the Redeemer and another honoring the ancient gods of his Germanic ancestors. This extraordinary building, more than any crown or treasure, symbolized the unique path that Rædwald had chosen to navigate one of the most challenging periods in English history. The story of how this remarkable temple came to exist begins not with religious revelation, but with the hard realities of 7th century politics. Around 604, as trade winds carried news of momentous changes across the North Sea, word reached Rædwald's court that something unprecedented was happening in the Kingdom of Kent. King Æthelfrith, the most powerful ruler in southern England, had undergone baptism and accepted the Christian faith at the hands of Augustine, a missionary sent directly from Rome by Pope Gregory the Great. For Rædwald, watching these developments from his palace on the banks of the River Devon, the implications were immediately clear. Christianity was not simply a matter of personal belief, was a political force that could reshape the landscape of Anglo-Saxon England. Æthelfrith's conversion had been followed by a flurry of diplomatic activity, with Christian kingdoms on the continent treating Kent as a preferred partner in trade and alliance negotiations. The Frankish kingdoms, in particular, were showing increased interest in developing closer ties with their newly Christian neighbour across the Channel. The invitation that arrived at Rædwald's court sometime around 604 was presented as a gesture of friendship between fellow kings, but the East Anglian ruler was far too sophisticated to miss its deeper significance. Æthelfrith was summoning him to Kent not merely for a social visit, but to witness the power and prosperity that had flowed to Kent following its king's conversion. More than that, it was an opportunity, perhaps an ultimatum for Rædwald to consider his own relationship with the new faith that was beginning to sweep across Western Europe. The journey to Canterbury was a revelation in itself. As Rædwald and his retinue made their way through the Kentish countryside, they encountered signs of change everywhere. New churches were rising beside ancient sacred groves, their stone walls and red tile roofs proclaiming the presence of a faith that had originated in lands far beyond the horizons of the Germanic world. Frankish merchants and craftsmen were increasingly common sights in Kentish towns, their presence a visible reminder of the commercial advantages that seemed to flow from Christian connections. The royal court that greeted Rædwald in Canterbury was a masterpiece of calculated demonstration. Æthelfrith had spared no expense in showcasing the magnificence that his new faith had brought to Kent. The king's personal regalia included items clearly influenced by Christian symbolism, while the ceremonies that marked daily life at court incorporated elements that would have been utterly foreign to traditional Anglo-Saxon practice just a few years earlier. Yet perhaps the most impressive aspect of what Rædwald witnessed was not the material prosperity, but the confidence and certainty that seemed to radiate from Æthelfrith himself. Here was a king who had managed to embrace a foreign religion while not only maintaining, but actually enhancing his political position. The divine favour that Anglo-Saxon kings had traditionally sought from Woden and the other Germanic gods seemed to have been transferred to this new deity, with even more spectacular results. The conversations that took place between the two kings during Rædwald's visit were conducted with all the courtesy appropriate to such occasions, but beneath the polite exchanges lay currents of power and persuasion that both men understood perfectly. Æthelfrith was not simply sharing his personal religious experience. He was offering Rædwald a partnership in what was clearly going to be the dominant political force of the future. The choice was stark: join the community of Christian kings and share in the benefits that such membership brought, or risk being isolated and eventually overwhelmed by the tide of change. The baptism ceremony that followed was both a personal transformation and a political statement. As the holy water was poured over Rædwald's head and the ancient words of the Christian liturgy were spoken over him, he was not merely accepting a new set of religious beliefs. He was allying himself with a network of power that stretched from the Irish Sea to the Mediterranean and beyond. The witnesses to this ceremony included not just Kentish nobles, but representatives of the broader Christian world. Men who would carry news of East Anglia's conversion back to courts and monasteries throughout Western Europe. Yet even as he underwent this momentous transformation, Rædwald's political instincts were calculating the costs and benefits of his decision. The advantages were obvious, and immediate closer ties with Kent, increased prestige among Christian kingdoms, and access to the sophisticated administrative and cultural resources of the Roman Church. But the disadvantages were equally significant. Many of his own nobles and warriors remained firmly attached to the ancestral faith, and forcing too rapid a change upon them risked internal discord that could fatally weaken his kingdom. The journey back to East Anglia provided Rædwald with time to contemplate the momentous step he had taken and to begin formulating a strategy for managing its consequences. The king who returned to his palace was outwardly the same man who had departed, but he carried with him new obligations, new opportunities, and new challenges that would test his political wisdom to its limits. The reception that awaited Rædwald upon his return revealed the complexity of the situation he now faced. His queen, a formidable woman, whose name has been lost to history but whose influence was clearly considerable, had spent his absence consulting with the traditional priests and wise men of the kingdom. Their counsel was unanimous and uncompromising. The king had been deceived by foreign sorcery and must immediately abandon this alien faith before it brought disaster upon the entire kingdom. The queen's arguments were both passionate and politically astute. She reminded her husband that the Wulfstunga dynasty had prospered for generations under the protection of Woden and the other ancestral gods. The sacred groves where these deities dwelt had been maintained by their family since time immemorial, and the rituals that ensured divine favor were woven into the very fabric of East Anglian society. To abandon these traditions would not only invite divine wrath, but would also alienate the very people whose loyalty formed the foundation of royal power. The crisis that followed tested Rædwald's political skills as severely as any military campaign he had ever fought. On one side stood the undeniable attractions of the Christian faith and the political advantages that embracing it could bring. On the other lay the deep-rooted traditions of his people and the very real risk that moving too quickly toward the new religion could tear his kingdom apart. The solution that Rædwald devised was both pragmatic and unprecedented. Rather than choosing between the competing faiths, he decided to embrace both. The temple that he ordered constructed was a physical manifestation of this revolutionary approach, building where Christian and pagan altars stood side by side, where prayers could be offered to Christ and to Woden with equal reverence, where the competing demands of old and new could be balanced and reconciled. This was not the decision of a man uncertain in his convictions, but the calculated choice of a ruler who understood that effective leadership sometimes required accepting apparent contradictions in order to achieve larger goals. Rædwald had grasped a fundamental truth that would elude many of his contemporaries, that religious change in Anglo-Saxon England would necessarily be a gradual process, and that attempts to force rapid transformation would likely result in chaos and resistance. The dual-altar temple became far more than a religious structure. It was a symbol of Rædwald's entire approach to the challenges of leadership in a changing world. Here was a king who could honor the traditions of his ancestors, while simultaneously embracing the innovations that would ensure his kingdom's future prosperity. Here was a ruler who refused to be forced into false choices between competing goods, but instead found ways to synthesize apparent opposites into new and more powerful combinations. The reaction to this unprecedented religious arrangement varied dramatically depending on the observer's perspective. Christian missionaries and foreign churchmen were often scandalized by what they saw as a fundamental misunderstanding of their faith's exclusive claims. The traditional priests of the Germanic gods were equally dismayed by what appeared to be a dilution of ancestral wisdom. Yet among the common people of East Anglia, Rædwald's solution was greeted with relief and approval. For ordinary East Anglians, the king's decision meant that they were not forced to choose between the faith of their fathers and the religion of their ruler. Farmers could continue to make offerings to the old gods for good harvests, while also seeking the blessing of Christ for their families. Warriors could invoke both Woden's wisdom and divine protection in battle. Merchants could call upon traditional deities for favorable winds, while also praying to Christian saints for safe voyages. This religious synthesis was reflected in the cultural life of Rædwald's kingdom in fascinating ways. The royal workshops began producing objects that combined Christian and pagan symbolism with stunning artistic effect. Brooches might feature crosses alongside traditional Germanic animal motifs. Ceremonial weapons bore inscriptions that invoked both Christ and the ancient gods. Even the oral literature performed at court began to incorporate elements from both traditions, creating a unique cultural fusion that would influence English literature for centuries to come. The political benefits of Rædwald's religious approach became apparent almost immediately. His baptism had opened doors to closer relationships with Christian kingdoms, but his continued tolerance for traditional beliefs ensured that he retained the loyalty of his own people. He could participate in the growing network of Christian rulers while avoiding the internal conflicts that religious transformation had brought to other kingdoms. News of Rædwald's unique religious arrangement spread throughout the Anglo-Saxon world and beyond, generating reactions that ranged from admiration to horror. Some saw his approach as wise statesmanship that recognized the complexity of the times, while others viewed it as dangerous compromise that satisfied no one fully. What no one could deny was that it seemed to work. East Anglia, under Rædwald, continued to prosper while other kingdoms struggled with the tensions created by religious change. The king's personal religious practice during this period appears to have been equally balanced. He participated in Christian ceremonies when diplomatic or political considerations made such participation appropriate, but he also continued to fulfill his traditional role as high priest in the ancient rituals that marked important moments in the agricultural and ceremonial calendar. This was not hypocrisy, but a sophisticated understanding that kingship in early medieval England involved sacred as well as secular responsibilities. Rædwald's queen, despite her initial opposition to Christianity, gradually came to appreciate the political wisdom of her husband's approach. She became skilled at navigating the complex social situations that arose when Christians and pagans needed to interact at court, helping to establish protocols that allowed both groups to participate in royal ceremonies without compromising their beliefs. Her influence was crucial in making the dual faith system work in practice rather than simply in theory. The establishment of the dual altar temple had broader implications that extended far beyond East Anglia itself. Other Anglo-Saxon rulers, facing similar pressures, began to look to Rædwald's example as a possible model for managing religious transition in their own kingdoms. While few were willing or able to implement exactly the same solution, the principle of gradual accommodation rather than forced conversion became increasingly common throughout England. The temple itself became a center of pilgrimage for people seeking to understand how traditional and Christian beliefs might be reconciled. Scholars and clerics from across Europe visited East Anglia to observe this unique religious experiment, carrying back reports that influenced theological and political thinking throughout the Christian world. Some were horrified by what they saw as doctrinal compromise, but others recognized the practical wisdom of an approach that seemed to minimize conflict while maximizing acceptance. As years passed, the success of Rædwald's religious policy became increasingly apparent. East Anglia remained internally peaceful, while other kingdoms experienced religious conflicts that sometimes erupted into civil war. The kingdom's prosperity continued to grow, suggesting that divine favor, whether from old gods, new god, or both, was not lacking. Most importantly, from a political perspective, Rædwald had managed to maintain his freedom of action in religious matters, while other kings found themselves increasingly constrained by the expectations of either Christian allies or pagan traditionalists. The wisdom of the king's approach was further vindicated by developments in neighboring kingdoms. Essex, which had undergone a more dramatic conversion to Christianity, experienced a violent pagan reaction following the death of its Christian king. Kent, despite its early embrace of the new faith, struggled with ongoing tensions between Christian and traditional elements in society. Rædwald's East Anglia, by contrast, seemed to have achieved a stable synthesis that satisfied most of its people most of the time. The Dualata temple stood as a monument to the possibility that seemingly irreconcilable differences could be bridged through wisdom, patience, and political skill. In an age when religious conflict was becoming increasingly common throughout Europe, Rædwald had demonstrated that alternative approaches were possible for those with the courage and intelligence to pursue them. Yet even as his religious policy achieved remarkable success, Rædwald understood that it was ultimately a transitional arrangement. The forces that were reshaping the religious landscape of Europe were too powerful to be permanently contained by any single ruler's policy. However wise, the question was not whether change would come, but whether it could be managed in ways that preserved the best elements of both old and new while minimizing the conflicts that had torn other societies apart. The king, who stood in his unique temple, offering prayers to Christ and Woden with equal reverence, was not simply trying to have things both ways. He was pioneering a new approach to leadership in an age of fundamental change in approach that recognized complexity rather than demanding simplification, that sought synthesis rather than insisting on purity, and that prioritized the welfare of his people over the approval of religious purists, whether Christian or pagan. This religious statesmanship would prove to be one of Rædwald's most enduring contributions to English history. While the specific arrangements he created would not survive his death, the principle he established that wise rulers could navigate religious change without destroying social harmony would influence English approaches to religious diversity for centuries to come. In a world too often torn apart by religious conflict, Rædwald had shown that alternatives were possible for those with the wisdom to pursue them. On a cold morning in the year 616, as frost sparkled on the reeds along the river Idle and mist rose from the waters that would soon run red with blood, two armies faced each other across what would become one of the most consequential battlefields in early English history. The fate of kingdoms hung in the balance. Dynasties would fall and rise, and the political map of Anglo-Saxon England would be redrawn forever. At the center of this momentous confrontation stood King Rædwald of East Anglia, about to fight the battle that would establish him as the most powerful ruler in England. The path to this fateful encounter had begun years earlier with a young prince named Edwin, heir to the Duran throne, but driven into exile by the ruthless ambition of Æthelfrith of Northumbria. Edwin's story was one that would have been familiar to any Anglo-Saxon warrior, a tale of dynastic conflict, betrayal, and the brutal realities of early medieval politics. When Æthelfrith had consolidated his control over both Bernicia and Deira, creating the powerful kingdom of Northumbria, Edwin had been forced to flee for his life, beginning a wandering existence that would take him from court to court across England. For years, Edwin had lived as a royal exile, always looking over his shoulder, never knowing when Æthelfrith's agents might catch up with him. He had found temporary refuge with various kings, but none were willing to risk the wrath of Northumbria's formidable ruler by harbouring his enemy indefinitely. Some had been sympathetic to Edwin's plight, but lacked the military strength to protect him effectively. Others had been tempted by Æthelfrith's offers of gold and alliance in exchange for delivering the troublesome exile. It was in this desperate condition that Edwin had finally arrived at Rædwald's court, throwing himself on the mercy of the East Anglian king and begging for sanctuary. The request placed Rædwald in an extraordinarily difficult position. On one hand, the laws of hospitality that governed Anglo-Saxon society demanded that he protect any guest who had sought refuge in his hall. To betray such a guest would bring dishonor not just upon the king himself, but upon his entire dynasty. On the other hand, harboring Edwin meant risking war with the most powerful military force in northern England. Æthelfrith of Northumbria was not a king to be trifled with. His reputation as a warrior was legendary throughout the Anglo-Saxon world, and his military achievements spoke for themselves. He had defeated Pictish armies in the far north, crushed British resistance in the west, and unified the fractious kingdoms of Bernicia and Deira under his single rule. Most ominously from Rædwald's perspective, he had shown himself to be utterly ruthless in pursuing his enemies. Regardless of where they might seek shelter, the diplomatic pressure began, almost immediately after Edwin's arrival in East Anglia. Æthelfrith's first embassy arrived at Rædwald's court bearing gifts and honeyed words, requesting the return of the exile as a matter of justice and friendship between fellow Anglo-Saxon kings. When Rædwald politely but firmly refused, explaining his obligations under the laws of hospitality, Æthelfrith's response escalated dramatically. The second embassy brought not just gifts but threats, accompanied by increasingly substantial offers of gold and promises of alliance if Rædwald would reconsider his position. Æthelfrith made it clear that he viewed Edwin's presence in East Anglia as an act of hostility that could not be tolerated indefinitely. The Northumbrian king's message was delivered with diplomatic courtesy, but its underlying meaning was unmistakable. Deliver Edwin or face the consequences. For Rædwald, weighing his options in the privacy of his council chamber, the choice appeared increasingly stark. On one side lay the very real threat of war with a kingdom whose military might dwarfed that of East Anglia. Æthelfrith commanded not just the warriors of Northumbria, but also had alliances with various British kingdoms that could provide additional troops. The prospect of facing such a coalition was daunting, even for a king of Rædwald's courage and military skill. On the other side stood the fundamental principles that governed his kingship and his honor. To betray a guest who had sought sanctuary would violate the most sacred laws of Anglo-Saxon society. Word of such treachery would spread throughout the known world, destroying Rædwald's reputation and undermining the very foundations of his authority. No warrior would trust a king who had proven himself capable of such betrayal, and no ally would rely on agreements made with a ruler who had shown himself willing to break the most fundamental obligations. The crisis deepened when a third embassy arrived, bearing an ultimatum that left no room for diplomatic maneuvering. The Northumbrian king's patience was at an end. Either Edwin would be delivered immediately, or Æthelfrith would come south with his army to collect the exile himself. The threat was not idle. Scouts reported that Northumbrian forces were already beginning to mobilize, and refugees from the border regions brought tales of preparations for war. It was at this crucial moment that Rædwald's queen stepped forward with counsel that would prove decisive. This remarkable woman, whose name has unfortunately been lost to history but whose influence on events was profound, understood both the political realities of the situation and the deeper principles at stake. She reminded her husband that he was not merely a political leader, but the heir to a sacred kingship that carried obligations to both gods and men. The Queen's words, as recorded by later chroniclers, cut to the heart of the matter with devastating clarity. She pointed out that a king who would sell his honor for gold was no king at all, merely a wealthy thief with pretensions to royal status. She reminded Rædwald that the Wulfstunga dynasty had built its reputation on keeping faith with allies and protecting those who sought their shelter. To abandon these principles now, no matter what the provocation, would not just dishonor Rædwald personally, but would betray the legacy of all his ancestors. More practically, she argued that yielding to Æthelfrith's threats would not end the danger, but would merely delay it, while demonstrating East Anglia's weakness to all potential enemies. If Rædwald could be intimidated into betraying a guest, what would prevent other ambitious kings from making similar demands in the future? The Queen's political analysis was as acute as her moral reasoning appeasement of one. Aggressor would only invite aggression from others. Her final argument was perhaps the most compelling of all. She reminded her husband that Edwin was not just any exile, but the rightful heir to the Doran throne. A prince with legitimate claims and potential supporters throughout Northumbria. If Æthelfrith could be defeated, Edwin's restoration would create a powerful ally on East Anglia's northern border, while simultaneously eliminating a dangerous enemy. The risk was enormous, but so was the potential reward. Rædwald's decision, when it came, was characteristic of the man, bold, calculated, and decisive. He would not merely refuse Æthelfrith's demands, but would actively challenge Northumbrian hegemony by supporting Edwin's claim to his ancestral throne. This was not a decision made in anger or desperation, but a carefully considered, strategic choice that recognized both the moral imperatives of kingship and the political realities of Anglo-Saxon England. The preparations for war that followed demonstrated the full extent of Rædwald's resources and organizational abilities. East Anglia might not have been able to match Northumbria's raw military power, but the kingdom possessed advantages that could be leveraged effectively with proper planning. The wealth accumulated through decades of profitable trade provided the means to equip and supply an army of exceptional quality. The kingdom's position as a center of international commerce had attracted warriors from many lands, creating a military force with diverse skills and experience. Most importantly, Rædwald's reputation as a just and generous king had won him allies throughout the Anglo-Saxon world. Kings who might not have been willing to challenge Æthelfrith on their own were prepared to join a coalition led by a ruler they respected and trusted. The army that began to assemble in East Anglia was not just an East Anglian force, but a coalition of kingdoms and noble warbands, united by their recognition of Rædwald's leadership. The king's personal involvement in these preparations was total and inspiring. He met with every contingent that joined his forces, thanking their leaders personally and ensuring that their warriors were properly equipped and supplied. He consulted with experienced commanders about tactics and strategy, drawing on the accumulated military wisdom of a generation of Anglo-Saxon warfare. Most importantly, he made it clear to everyone that this was not just a war to protect a single exile, but a struggle for the principle that smaller kingdoms could not be bullied and intimidated by their more powerful neighbors. As news of the impending conflict spread throughout England, it became clear that this would be far more than a local dispute between neighboring kingdoms. The outcome would determine whether Æthelfrith's vision of Northumbrian hegemony would be accepted by the other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, or whether the principle of independence would be maintained. Kings throughout England watched the developing situation with intense interest, understanding that their own future freedom might depend on the outcome of the coming battle. The march north from East Anglia was conducted with the careful precision that characterized all of Rædwald's military operations. The army moved along well-planned routes that ensured adequate supplies, while avoiding unnecessary damage to the lands through which they passed. Scouts ranged far ahead to gather intelligence about Northumbrian movements, while diplomatic envoys worked to secure the neutrality of kingdoms through whose territory the army would need to pass. One of the most poignant aspects of the expedition was the participation of Rædwald's own son, Riganhir, who had insisted on accompanying his father despite the obvious dangers. The young prince had grown to manhood in his father's court, absorbing the values of honor, courage, and loyalty that defined the Wulfstunga dynasty. For him, this campaign represented not just a military adventure, but a chance to prove himself worthy of his heritage and his eventual inheritance. The reunion between Edwin and his homeland was an emotional moment that even hardened warriors found moving. As the army crossed into Duran territory, they were greeted by people who remembered Edwin as a young prince and who had suffered under Æthelfrith's harsh rule. The sight of their rightful king returning at the head of a powerful army sparked uprisings throughout the region, as long-suppressed resentments against Northumbrian domination finally found expression. Æthelfrith, for his part, had not been idle during the months of diplomatic maneuvering and military preparation. The Northumbrian king understood that he faced the greatest challenge of his reign and possibly the greatest threat to his dynasty's survival. He had called in every favor, activated every alliance, and mobilized every available warrior in response to what he correctly recognized as an existential threat to his power. The Northumbrian army that assembled to meet Rædwald's challenge was formidable by any standard. Its core consisted of the seasoned warriors who had conquered Dira and Bernicia, men whose loyalty to Æthelfrith had been tested in numerous battles and proven absolute. These troops were supported by contingents from allied British kingdoms, warriors who had their own reasons for fearing the resurgence of Anglo-Saxon power under new leadership. Yet for all his military preparations, Æthelfrith faced significant disadvantages that would prove crucial in the coming battle. His rapid consolidation of power in Northumbria had created many enemies, and his harsh rule had bred resentment among those he governed. The very speed with which Edwin's return had sparked uprisings demonstrated that Northumbrian unity was more fragile than it appeared on the surface. The two armies finally met on the eastern bank of the River Idle, near the border between Mercia and Lindsey, on a day that would be remembered for generations as one of the turning points in English history. The location was symbolically appropriate a boundary region where the authority of different kingdoms blurred together, just as the battle would blur the existing boundaries of power and influence. The battle itself unfolded with the brutal intensity that characterized Anglo-Saxon warfare. Both armies were composed of experienced warriors fighting for causes they believed in passionately. Æthelfrith's forces fought to preserve the hegemony they had built through years of conquest and consolidation. Rædwald's coalition fought for the principle that might should not automatically triumph over right, and that courage and justice could still prevail against seemingly overwhelming odds. The fighting was fierce from the very beginning, with neither side able to gain a decisive advantage in the initial exchanges. The shield walls clashed with a sound like thunder, while the war cries of both armies echoed across the battlefield. Individual acts of heroism and sacrifice multiplied as warriors on both sides demonstrated the courage that made Anglo-Saxon warfare legendary throughout Europe. The turning point came when Æthelfrith, recognizing Edwin among the enemy ranks, led a desperate charge designed to end the battle by killing the rival claimant to the Duran throne. The Northumbrian king's tactical thinking was sound without Edwin. Rædwald's justification for the war would disappear, and the coalition might well collapse even if it won the battle. But in his eagerness to strike down Edwin, Æthelfrith made a fatal error of identification. In the confusion of battle, with warriors clad in similar armor and covered in mud and blood, he mistook Rigenhere for Edwin and concentrated his attack on the wrong target. The young East Anglian prince fought with the courage of his lineage, but he was overwhelmed by the concentrated assault of Æthelfrith's personal retinue. The death of Rigenhere sent a shock wave through both armies, but its effect on the two forces was dramatically different. The Northumbrians, believing they had achieved their primary objective, began to celebrate their apparent victory. The East Anglians and their allies, however, were galvanized by grief and rage into a fury that made them temporarily unstoppable. Response to his son's death demonstrated why he was recognized as one of the greatest warrior kings of his age. Rather than being paralyzed by grief, he channeled his anguish into a berserker rage that inspired his entire army. His personal charge into the Northumbrian ranks became the stuff of legend as the East Anglian king cut his way through enemy warriors like a man possessed by the spirits of his ancestors. The momentum of the battle shifted decisively in that moment. The Northumbrian forces, confident of victory just moments before, found themselves facing enemies who seemed to have been transformed by supernatural fury. The careful formations that had served Æthelfrith so well in previous battles began to crumble under the weight of an assault that combined tactical skill with overwhelming emotional intensity. Æthelfrith himself fell in the melee that followed, struck down by weapons that may have been wielded by Rædwald personally. The death of the Northumbrian king broke the last resistance of his army, as warriors who had followed him loyally for years suddenly found themselves leaderless in the face of an implacable enemy. The retreat that followed quickly turned into a rout, with Northumbrian forces scattered across the countryside. The immediate aftermath of the battle was a scene of carnage that would be remembered in songs and stories for generations. The River Idle ran red with blood, giving rise to the saying that would echo through Anglo-Saxon poetry. The River Idle was foul with the blood of Englishmen. Yet, amid the slaughter, the political consequences of the battle were already becoming apparent. Edwin's restoration to the throne of Dera was accomplished with remarkable speed, as the prince who had lived in exile for so many years suddenly found himself king of one of the most important kingdoms in England. The Northumbrian unity that Æthelfrith had built through conquest and intimidation collapsed almost overnight, as Bernicia reverted to its traditional independence, while Dara welcomed back its rightful ruler. For Rædwald, the victory at the River Idle represented the culmination of a carefully planned strategy that had transformed him from a regional king into the most powerful ruler in Anglo-Saxon England. His willingness to risk everything for principle had been vindicated in the most dramatic possible fashion, while his military and political skills had been demonstrated to the entire known world. Yet the cost of victory was personal as well as political. The death of Rigenhere had robbed Rædwald not just of a beloved son, but also of his intended heir and successor. The grief that the king felt was evident to all who saw him in the days following the battle, a reminder that even the greatest triumphs came with prices that could never be fully calculated in advance. The political transformation that followed, the Battle of the River Idle, extended far beyond the immediate participants. Kings throughout England were forced to reassess their own positions and policies in light of Rædwald's dramatic demonstration that even the most powerful kingdoms could be challenged successfully. The balance of power that had seemed so stable just months earlier was now fundamentally altered. Rædwald's emergence as the dominant figure in Anglo-Saxon politics was recognized formally when he was acknowledged as Bretwalda, the Overlord, whose authority was accepted by other rulers throughout southern England. This was not merely an honorary title, but a recognition of real power and influence that would shape English politics for years to come. The battle had demonstrated several important principles that would influence Anglo-Saxon warfare and politics. For generations, it showed that superior numbers and reputation did not guarantee victory when facing enemies with superior motivation and leadership. It proved that coalitions of smaller kingdoms could successfully challenge larger powers when united by effective leadership and common cause. Most importantly, it established that honor and principle could still triumph in a world that often seemed dominated by naked ambition and ruthless pragmatism. The victory at the River Idle also had profound implications for the religious transformation that was sweeping across Anglo-Saxon England. Edwin's restoration to the Durrand throne would ultimately lead to his conversion to Christianity and the spread of the new faith throughout Northumbria. Rædwald's own unique religious position, maintaining altars to both Christ and the traditional gods, had proven compatible with decisive military action and political success. As news of the battle spread throughout Europe, it enhanced Rædwald's reputation not just within England but throughout the wider world. Christian kingdoms on the continent saw him as a ruler who combined military prowess with religious tolerance, while Scandinavian courts heard tales of a king who had honored the warrior traditions of their shared ancestors. The victory established East Anglia as a major power that demanded respect and consideration in international affairs. The Battle of the River Idle stands as one of the decisive moments in early English history, a confrontation that demonstrated how individual courage and wise leadership could reshape the destiny of kingdoms and peoples. In the person of Rædwald, the values of honor, loyalty, and justice had triumphed over those of intimidation, brutality, and naked ambition. The king who had risked everything to protect a guest had been rewarded with power and influence beyond anything his predecessors could have imagined. Yet even in his moment of greatest triumph, Rædwald understood that victory brought new responsibilities and new challenges. The position of Bretwalda was not one that could be maintained through military might alone. It required the same combination of wisdom, justice, and political skill that had made the victory possible in the first place. The king who had won the greatest battle of his generation now faced the task of proving that he could use his power as wisely as he had won it. In the golden years that followed his stunning victory at the River Idle, King Rædwald of East Anglia stood at the pinnacle of Anglo-Saxon power, wielding influence that stretched from the Scottish borders to the English Channel. The title of Bretwalda, Wide Ruler or Ruler of Britain, was more than mere ceremonial recognition. It represented genuine authority over the complex web of kingdoms, alliances, and competing interests that made up early 7th century England. For perhaps the first and only time in his dynasty's history, an East Anglian king commanded the respect and deference of rulers throughout the land. The transformation of Rædwald's position in the aftermath of his victory was dramatic and far-reaching. Where once he had been merely another regional king, distinguished perhaps by his wealth and diplomatic skill, but ultimately limited by his kingdom's geographic isolation, he now found himself at the center of Anglo-Saxon political life. Embassies from distant kingdoms made their way regularly to his court, seeking alliance, arbitration, or simply the opportunity to pay their respects to the most powerful ruler in England. The court that these ambassadors encountered was a marvel that reflected both the ancient traditions of Germanic kingship and the sophisticated cosmopolitan culture that East Anglia's wealth had made possible. The great hall where Rædwald held audience was a masterpiece of Anglo-Saxon architecture and craftsmanship. Its soaring timber frame supporting a roof that seemed to reach toward the very heavens. The walls were hung with tapestries that told the stories of heroes and gods, while the pillars that supported the roof were carved with intricate patterns that spoke of divine favor and royal power. But it was the treasure displayed throughout the hall that truly captured the attention of visitors. Gold and silver gleamed in the firelight, while precious gems caught and reflected the flames in brilliant flashes of color. These were not merely ornaments, but symbols of power, each piece carefully chosen to convey messages about Rædwald's wealth, his connections to the wider world, and his ability to reward loyalty and service. The king's personal regalia was particularly magnificent, incorporating elements from across the known world: Roman silver, Frankish gold, Byzantine silk, and Scandinavian amber combined in displays of craftsmanship that were unsurpassed anywhere. In Northern Europe, the daily life of Rædwald's court during these golden years was a carefully orchestrated demonstration of royal power and cultural sophistication. Each day began with ceremonies that honored both the Christian god and the traditional deities, reflecting the king's unique religious position, while demonstrating his commitment to maintaining harmony among his diverse subjects. The temple that he had constructed remained a central focus of court life, serving as a powerful symbol of his ability to reconcile apparently irreconcilable differences. The diplomatic activity that flowed through Rædwald's court was constant and complex. As Bretwalda, he was expected to mediate disputes between lesser kings, to arbitrate conflicts that might otherwise escalate into devastating wars, and to provide leadership in matters that affected the common interests of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. This was delicate work that required not just authority, but wisdom, patience, and a deep understanding of the competing interests and ancient grievances that shaped relationships between the various realms. One of Rædwald's greatest achievements during this period was his management of the relationship between Edwin of Northumbria and the other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Edwin's restoration to the Daron throne had created a powerful new player on the political scene, but it had also generated tensions and uncertainties that could have destabilized the entire system. Edwin was grateful to Rædwald for his restoration, but he was also ambitious and proud, eager to rebuild Northumbrian power and reclaim his kingdom's traditional dominance in northern England. The challenge for Rædwald was to maintain Edwin's loyalty and cooperation while preventing him from becoming so powerful that he might challenge East Anglian supremacy. This required a delicate balance of encouragement and restraint, of support and subtle limitation that tested all of the Bretwalda's diplomatic skills. Rædwald's solution was to position himself as Edwin's mentor and ally, while simultaneously ensuring that other kingdoms remained strong enough to serve as counterweights to Northumbrian ambition. The success of this policy was evident in the stability that characterized Anglo-Saxon England during Rædwald's years as Bretwalda, where previous periods had been marked by constant warfare and shifting alliances. The early decades of the 7th century saw an unprecedented period of relative peace and prosperity. This was not merely the peace of exhaustion that sometimes follows devastating conflicts, but a genuine stability based on mutual respect for Rædwald's authority and recognition of the benefits that his leadership brought to all parties. The economic prosperity that accompanied this political stability was remarkable. Trade flourished as merchants could travel safely between kingdoms, confident that disputes would be resolved through negotiation rather than warfare. The great trading centres of Anglo-Saxon England, London, York, Canterbury, and especially Ipswich, in Rædwald's own kingdom expounded, rapidly as goods flowed along established routes without the disruptions that had previously characterized commercial life. East Anglia, as the center of this new order, experienced unprecedented prosperity. The kingdom's position as a gateway between England and the continent made it a natural hub for international trade, while Rædwald's reputation for justice and reliability attracted merchants from across the known world. Ships bearing goods from Scandinavia, the Rhine Valley, Francia, and even the distant Eastern Roman Empire regularly docked at East Anglian ports, bringing not just material wealth, but cultural exchange that enriched the kingdom's intellectual and artistic life. The royal workshops of East Anglia during this period produced some of the finest art and craftsmanship in all of Europe. The metalworkers who created jewelry and decorative objects for the royal court achieved levels of technical skill and artistic sophistication that would not be surpassed for centuries. The intricate cloison work that characterized the finest pieces combined Germanic artistic traditions with techniques learned from Byzantine and Frankish craftsmen, creating a distinctive style that was recognizably East Anglian while incorporating influences from across the civilized world. Literature and learning also flourished under Rædwald's patronage. The court attracted scholars, poets, and storytellers from throughout Europe, creating an intellectual environment that was remarkably cosmopolitan for its time. The ancient oral traditions of the Germanic peoples were preserved and transmitted by skilled shops who could recite thousands of lines of poetry from memory, while new compositions celebrated the deeds of contemporary heroes and the glory of the Wulfstunga dynasty. The religious synthesis that Rædwald had pioneered continued to evolve during these years, developing into a sophisticated theological and philosophical system that attracted attention from across Europe. Christian scholars who visited his court were often surprised to find that the king's unusual religious practices had produced not chaos or contradiction, but a remarkably stable and harmonious society. Some began to wonder whether the confrontational approach that characterized Christian missions in other kingdoms might not be the only possible path to religious transformation. Rædwald's personal role in maintaining this complex system was crucial and demanding. As Bretwalda, he was expected to be available to resolve disputes at any hour of the day or night, to provide wise counsel on matters ranging from trade regulations to marriage alliances, and to demonstrate through his own conduct the virtues that he expected from his subjects and subordinate rulers. This was exhausting work that required not just political skill, but genuine wisdom and an unwavering commitment to justice. The king's daily routine during these years reflected the multiple demands placed upon him. Each morning began with religious observances that honored both the Christian God and the traditional deities, followed by audiences with petitioners who sought royal justice or intervention. The afternoons were typically devoted to diplomatic correspondence and consultation with advisors, while the evenings were reserved for the ceremonial aspects of kingships, gift-giving, and the cultural activities that maintained the bonds between ruler and ruled. The feast hall was particularly important in Anglo-Saxon political culture, serving as the venue where loyalty was demonstrated and reinforced through elaborate rituals of hospitality and gift exchange. Rædwald's feasts during his years as Bretwalda were legendary for their magnificence, with guests from across Europe gathering to witness displays of royal generosity that sometimes involved the distribution of treasures worth more than entire kingdom's annual revenues. These occasions were not merely social events, but important diplomatic opportunities where alliances were negotiated, conflicts were resolved, and the bonds of loyalty that held the Anglo-Saxon world together were renewed and strengthened. The careful choreography of such events required months of planning and preparation, with every detail designed to convey messages about power relationships, status, hierarchies, and the Bretwalda's expectations for his subordinate rulers. The military aspects of Rædwald's power during this period were less visible but no less important than the diplomatic and ceremonial elements. The peace that characterized his reign was not simply the result of goodwill and wise leadership, but was ultimately guaranteed by the knowledge that East Anglia possessed military forces capable of enforcing the Bretwalda's will. The royal warband that served as Rædwald's personal retinue was maintained at the highest possible standard, equipped with the finest weapons and armor that money could buy, and trained to a level of proficiency that made them a match for any force in Europe. Beyond this elite corps, Rædwald could call upon the military resources of his entire kingdom and, when necessary, upon allied forces from kingdoms that acknowledged his supremacy. The logistical capabilities required to mobilize and sustain such forces were considerable and represented a significant advance in administrative sophistication over previous Anglo-Saxon military organizations. The intelligence network that supported Rædwald's decision-making was equally impressive. Merchants, pilgrims, and diplomatic envoys provided a constant stream of information about developments throughout Europe, while the king's own agents gathered intelligence about potential threats or opportunities. This information was carefully analyzed by a council of advisors who combined expertise in military affairs, diplomacy, and administration to provide their master with the knowledge needed for effective leadership. The cultural flowering that characterized East Anglia during Rædwald's golden years extended far beyond the royal court to encompass the entire kingdom. Prosperity brought leisure, and leisure allowed for the development of arts and learning that enriched the lives of people at every level of society. Local craftsmen began to incorporate elements of royal court style into their own work, while farmers and merchants prospered sufficiently to commission luxury goods that would have been beyond their reach in earlier generations. The kingdom's reputation for learning and culture attracted visitors from across Europe who came to study East Anglian innovations in everything from metalworking techniques to agricultural practices. This intellectual exchange benefited both the visitors and their hosts, creating networks of knowledge and communication that extended East Anglian influence far beyond the kingdom's political boundaries. Religious life during this period reflected the same synthesis and tolerance that characterized other aspects of Rædwald's reign. Christians and pagans lived side by side in relative harmony, with both groups contributing to the kingdom's prosperity and cultural life. The theological discussions that took place at court between representatives of different religious traditions were often surprisingly sophisticated, suggesting that religious tolerance could coexist with serious intellectual engagement with fundamental questions of belief and practice. The economic policies that Rædwald implemented during his years as Bretwalda were remarkably advanced for their time. He understood that sustainable prosperity required not just the accumulation of wealth, but its wise distribution and investment. The royal treasury supported not just military forces and diplomatic activities, but also infrastructure projects that benefited the entire kingdom: roads, bridges, markets, and fortifications that enhanced both economic development and military security. The king's approach to taxation and tribute was equally sophisticated. Rather than simply extracting as much wealth as possible from his subjects and subordinate kingdoms, he sought to create systems that encouraged economic growth while providing the resources necessary for effective governance. This required a delicate balance between royal needs and the prosperity of those who generated the kingdom's wealth. The legal system that developed under Rædwald's leadership combined traditional Anglo-Saxon customs with innovations designed to address the increasingly complex society that prosperity had created. Disputes between merchants from different kingdoms required legal frameworks that could accommodate varying customs and legal traditions, while the growth of towns and cities created new types of conflicts that traditional rural law was ill-equipped to handle. The Bretwalda's role in developing these legal innovations was both practical and symbolic. His personal involvement in important legal cases demonstrated his commitment to justice, while establishing precedents that would guide future decisions. The law codes that were developed during this period reflected both the influence of traditional Germanic legal principles and newer ideas, derived from contact with Roman and Christian legal traditions. As the years of prosperity and stability continued, Rædwald's reputation grew to legendary proportions. Stories of his wisdom, justice, and generosity spread throughout Europe, creating a diplomatic capital that was as valuable as any military force. Kings and emperors sought his alliance and friendship, while merchants and scholars competed for the opportunity to visit his court and participate in the cultural flowering that he had fostered. Yet even at the height of his power and influence, Rædwald remained aware that his position depended ultimately on his ability to continue providing the leadership that had made his success possible. The title of Bretwalda was not hereditary, and the loyalty of subordinate kingdoms was conditional on continued demonstration of the virtues that had earned their respect in the first place. The king who sat on his throne in the great hall at Rendlesham, surrounded by treasures from across the known world and receiving homage from rulers who had once been his equals, understood that his greatest challenge was not achieving power but maintaining it. The golden age that he had created was a remarkable achievement, but it was also a fragile one that required constant vigilance and wisdom to preserve. The legacy of Rædwald's years as Bretwalda would extend far beyond his own lifetime and kingdom. The precedents he established for religious tolerance, diplomatic leadership, and economic development would influence English political culture for centuries to come. The demonstration that smaller kingdoms could achieve greatness through wise leadership and principled governance provided inspiration for future generations of rulers who faced their own challenges and opportunities. Most importantly, perhaps, Rædwald had shown that the highest levels of political power could be compatible with moral authority and cultural achievement. In an age when kingship was often associated with brutality and narrow self-interest, he had demonstrated that true greatness came from the ability to serve something larger than oneself, whether that was justice, learning, prosperity, or the welfare of one's people. The Bretwalda who ruled from his golden hall was creating more than just a kingdom or even an empire. He was establishing ideals and institutions that would help to shape the future of England itself. The boy who had grown up listening to ancient songs had become a king whose own deeds would be worthy of the bards. But more than that, he had created a legacy that would echo through the centuries in ways that even he could not have imagined. As the gentle evening light faded over the River Deben in the year 624, the greatest funeral procession in Anglo-Saxon history made its solemn way toward a low hill overlooking the water. King Rædwald, the mighty Bretwalda, who had balanced the faiths and united kingdoms under his wise rule, had breathed his last, and now his people prepared to honor him with a burial ceremony that would echo through the centuries as one of the most magnificent expressions of royal power and divine kingship ever attempted in Northern Europe. The death of Rædwald had come peacefully, as befitted a king who had brought decades of prosperity and stability to his realm. In his final years, he had seen his kingdom reach heights of wealth and influence that his ancestors could barely have imagined. while his own reputation as a wise and just ruler had spread throughout the known world. Yet mortality claims even the greatest of kings, and when the end came, Rædwald faced it with the same courage and dignity that had characterized his entire reign. The news of the king's death spread throughout East Anglia with remarkable speed, carried by royal messengers, who rode through the night to ensure that every corner of the kingdom learnt of their loss before dawn broke over the marshlands. The reaction was immediate and profound, not just grief for a beloved ruler, but recognition that an age was ending and that the kingdom would never quite be the same again. In the great hall at Rendlesham, where Rædwald had held court for more than 2 decades, his body lay in state surrounded by the treasures that had symbolized his earthly power. The dual altars that had characterized his unique religious approach were both adorned with offerings, as Christians and pagans alike sought to ensure that their departed king would find favor in whatever afterlife awaited him. The sight was both magnificent and poignant, a physical embodiment of the synthesis that had been Rædwald's greatest achievement, and perhaps his most enduring legacy. The planning for the king's funeral had actually begun years earlier, as Rædwald himself had taken a personal interest in ensuring that his burial would properly reflect both his achievements and his aspirations for his dynasty's eternal glory. The site chosen for this momentous ceremony was a low hill overlooking the River Deben, near the royal residence at Sutton, location that had already served as a burial ground for members of the royal family, but which would now become the setting for the most elaborate funeral ever staged in Anglo-Saxon England. The preparations that followed the king's death were extraordinary in their scope and complexity. Master craftsmen from across the kingdom and beyond were summoned to contribute their skills to creating grave goods worthy of the royal workshops that had produced magnificent objects throughout Rædwald's reign now turned their attention to creating a burial assemblage that would proclaim the dead king's status for all eternity. The centerpiece of these preparations was the ship itself, not just any vessel, but a magnificent oak-built craft that had served as the king's own royal barge during his lifetime. This was no mere boat, but a ship worthy of carrying a king across the whale road to whatever destination awaited him in the afterlife. Nearly 90 feet in length and built with the finest craftsmanship available in the early 7th century, it was a masterpiece of Anglo-Saxon shipbuilding that represented both the kingdom's maritime traditions and its connections to the wider world of North Sea culture. The ship was dragged from the river up the gentle slope of the hill, in a massive undertaking that required the coordinated effort of hundreds of workers. The logistics of moving such a large vessel over land were formidable, requiring specially constructed rollers, ropes, and probably temporary roadways to distribute the weight and prevent damage to the precious cargo. The entire operation took days to complete and became a public demonstration of the kingdom's commitment to honoring their departed ruler. With appropriate Mayfi CENCE. Once the ship had been positioned on the hilltop, work began on excavating the massive trench that would contain both vessel and grave goods. This was not merely a practical necessity, but a ritual act that connected the burial to ancient traditions of earth magic and sacred kingship. The soil removed from the excavation was carefully set aside, as it would later be used to construct the great mound that would mark the king's resting place for generations to come. The burial chamber itself was constructed within the ship's hull, using the finest timber available and decorated with carvings and metalwork that transformed it into a miniature palace worthy of an eternal king. The walls were hung with magnificent textiles that had been specially woven for the occasion, while the floor was covered with the finest carpets and furs that the kingdom could provide. This was to be not just a tomb, but a throne room where Rædwald could continue to hold court in the afterlife. The selection and arrangement of grave goods that would accompany the king into eternity represented one of the most complex and symbolically rich assemblages ever created in the Anglo-Saxon world. Every object was chosen not just for its intrinsic value but for its meaning, its ability to tell the story of Rædwald's life and achievements, and to ensure that future generations would understand the magnitude of his reign. The king's personal regalia formed the core of the burial assemblage. His great gold belt buckle, weighing more than a pound and decorated with intricate animal interlace, was positioned near his waist as a symbol of the royal authority that had bound the kingdom together during his lifetime. The massive gold shoulder clasps that had fastened his ceremonial armor were arranged to suggest the presence of the royal war gear that had made him feared and respected throughout the Anglo-Saxon world. Perhaps the most magnificent single object in the burial was the helmet that had protected the king's head in battle and ceremony alike. This was not merely armor, but a work of art that combined practical function with symbolic meaning in ways that captured the very essence of Anglo-Saxon kingship. The iron cap was covered with bronze panels, decorated with scenes of warriors in combat, while the face mask combined human and animal features in ways that suggested divine transformation and supernatural power. The helmet's symbolism was complex and multifaceted. The eyebrow guards were inlaid with garnet that caught and reflected light, like the eyes of a living being, while the mustache and facial features gave the wearer an appearance that was both human and otherworldly. Most remarkably, the entire helmet could be interpreted as representing a dragon, with the eyebrow guards forming wings and the mustache serving as the creature's tail. This was kingship as shamanic transformation, rulership that transcended the merely human and partook of divine and supernatural power. The weapons that accompanied Rædwald into the afterlife were equally magnificent and symbolic. His sword, with its pattern-welded blade and golden garnet pommel, was the work of master smiths who had created not just a weapon but a symbol of royal justice and divine favor. The spears and shields that surrounded the burial chamber spoke of the military prowess that had made East Anglia respected throughout the Anglo-Saxon world, while their decorative elements connected the king to the ancient warrior traditions of his Germanic ancestors. The ceremonial whetstone that was placed near the king's head was perhaps the most enigmatic and significant object in the entire assemblage. This was not a functional tool, but a symbolic scepter carved with human faces, and topped with a bronze stag that connected Rædwald to the sacred kingship traditions that stretched back to the earliest Germanic religion. The whetstone's symbolism was complex. It represented the king's role as the one who sharpened the weapons of his warriors, who maintained the cutting edge of royal justice, and who served as the link between the human and divine worlds. The treasure that filled the burial chamber reflected Rædwald's position at the center of an international network of trade and diplomacy that spanned the known world. Silver bowls and dishes from the Byzantine Empire demonstrated the kingdom's connections to the Christian East, while drinking horns made from aurochs, the great wild cattle that were already becoming extinct, connected the burial to the ancient hunting traditions of the Germanic peoples. Perhaps most significantly, a pair of silver spoons bore the names Solos and Paulos, apparently representing the Apostle Paul before and after his conversion on the road to Damascus. These objects, which may have been gifts marking Rædwald's own baptism, captured perfectly the religious synthesis that had characterized his reign, the accommodation between old and new faiths. That had been one of his greatest achievements. The coins found in the burial purse provided crucial evidence for dating the ceremony, while also demonstrating the international nature of Rædwald's kingdom. These Frankish gold pieces, each from a different mint, had been carefully collected to create a symbolic representation of the king's wide-ranging diplomatic connections. The number of coins, 37 plus 3 blanks, and 2 ingots, may have had specific ritual significance, perhaps representing payment for the ghostly oarsman who would row the king's ship to its final destination. The textiles that were interred with Rædwald represented some of the finest work available in early 7th century Europe. Fragments of silk imported from the Byzantine Empire mingled with woolens woven in East Anglia itself, while the leather goods included shoes and belts decorated with metalwork that demonstrated the sophisticated craft traditions that had flourished. Under royal patronage, the burial also included objects that spoke to the domestic and peaceful aspects of kingship. Cauldrons and serving vessels suggested the royal duty of hospitality, while a magnificent hanging bowl with enameled decorations represented the artistic traditions that connected Anglo-Saxon England to the Celtic world. A lyre, carefully preserved in a beaverskin bag, symbolized the king's role as patron of the poets and storytellers who preserved the cultural memory of his people. The religious objects in the burial reflected the same careful balance between Christian and pagan traditions that had characterized Rædwald's approach to faith throughout his reign. Alongside objects with clear Christian symbolism were items that connected the king to the ancestral gods and traditions of the Germanic peoples. This was not theological confusion, but deliberate synthesis, a final statement of the religious policy that had been one of Rædwald's most innovative contributions to Anglo-Saxon kingship. The ceremony itself, when it finally took place, was attended by representatives from kingdoms throughout Anglo-Saxon England and beyond. This was not just an East Anglian funeral, but a statement to the entire world about the nature of Germanic kingship and the power that wealth and wisdom could achieve when properly combined. The procession that accompanied Rædwald's body to its final resting place included kings and nobles from across northern Europe, testament to the international significance that his reign had achieved. The ritual aspects of the burial ceremony combined elements from both Christian and pagan traditions in ways that reflected the religious synthesis that had characterized Rædwald's reign. Prayers were offered to ensure the king's safe passage to whatever afterlife awaited him, while the ceremonial lighting of fires and the distribution of grave goods followed patterns that stretched back to the earliest Germanic burial practices. The positioning of objects within the burial chamber was not random, but followed careful protocols that ensured both practical and symbolic appropriateness. The king's personal weapons were placed where they would be easily accessible should he need them in the afterlife, while ceremonial objects were arranged to suggest the continuing reality of his royal status even in death. The construction of the great mound that covered the burial was itself a massive undertaking that required weeks of labor by hundreds of workers. The soil that had been removed from the ship's trench was supplemented by additional earth to create a burial mound that rose high enough to be visible from the river and the surrounding countryside. This was intended not just as a grave marker, but as a permanent monument to Rædwald's achievements and a visible reminder to future generations of the greatness that was possible for those who combined wisdom, courage, and divine favor. The completed mound became an immediate landmark that dominated the landscape for miles around. Ships sailing on the River Devon could see it from a considerable distance, while travelers on land used it as a navigation point. This visibility was intentional. The burial was meant to be not just a private family matter, but a public statement about the nature of kingship and the eternal significance of royal achievement. The archaeological evidence suggests that the burial mound was completed with remarkable speed and efficiency, reflecting both the organizational capabilities of the East Anglian kingdom and the importance that was attached to honoring the dead king appropriately. The final ceremonies that marked the completion of the burial included feasts and gift-giving that lasted for days, as nobles and commoners alike participated in celebrating Rædwald's life and achievements. The impact of Rædwald's burial on contemporary observers was immediate and profound. Never before had an Anglo-Saxon king been honored with such magnificent grave goods or such elaborate ceremony. The burial set new standards for royal display that would influence funeral practices throughout Northern Europe for generations to come. Word of the magnificent burials spread quickly throughout the Anglo-Saxon world and beyond, carried by the many foreign visitors who had witnessed the ceremony. The treasures that had been interred with Rædwald were described in almost mythical terms, while the ship burial itself was recognized as an unprecedented demonstration of royal power and cultural sophistication. The religious significance of the burial was equally important. By successfully combining Christian and pagan elements in a single ceremony, Rædwald's funeral demonstrated that the religious synthesis he had pioneered could extend even beyond death. This provided a model for other rulers who were struggling to manage the religious transitions that were reshaping early medieval Europe. The artistic and cultural legacy of the burial was immediate and lasting. The magnificent objects that had been created for the ceremony represented the highest achievements of early medieval craftsmanship and served as inspiration for artists and craftsmen throughout Northern Europe. The distinctive style that characterized many of the grave goods, particularly the intricate garnet cloison work, became a hallmark of high-status Anglo-Saxon art. Perhaps most importantly, the Sutton burial established a new conception of what royal burial could accomplish. This was not merely disposal of the dead, but transformation of mortality into legend, of earthly achievement into eternal significance. The king who was buried beneath the great mound would continue to influence English history long after his earthly reign had ended. The immediate aftermath of the burial saw East Anglia enter a period of transition as Rædwald's successors attempted to maintain the power and influence that he had built. The challenge was enormous. Replacing a king of such remarkable abilities and achievements would have been difficult under any circumstances. While the magnificent burial had set expectations for royal performance that would be hard to match, yet the burial itself had created a resource that would serve the dynasty for generations to come. The great mound overlooking the River Deben became a pilgrimage site that attracted visitors from across the known world, enhancing East Anglia's reputation and providing continuing evidence of the kingdom's former greatness. The treasures buried with Rædwald might be invisible, but their legendary status contributed to the kingdom's prestige in ways that were both subtle and significant. The Sutton burial represented the culmination of everything that Rædwald had achieved during his remarkable reign. The wealth that had been accumulated through wise governance and successful diplomacy, the artistic traditions that had flourished under royal patronage, the religious synthesis that had brought peace to a divided society, and the international connections that had made East Anglia a major player in European politics. All of these achievements were symbolized and preserved in the magnificent assemblage that accompanied the king into eternity. More than 13 centuries later, when archaeologists finally excavated the Great Mound and revealed its contents to an amazed world, they uncovered not just treasures, but a window into one of the most remarkable periods in English history. The burial that had been intended to preserve Rædwald's memory for his immediate successors had achieved something far greater, had preserved his legacy for all future generations, creating one of the most important archaeological sites in the world and ensuring that the story of the East Anglian Bretwalda would continue to inspire and amaze people long after his kingdom had passed into history. The ship that carried Rædwald to his final rest had completed the most important voyage of its existence, bearing not just a king, but the hopes and dreams of an entire people who had achieved greatness under his leadership. The treasures that surrounded him in death were more than mere grave goods. They were symbols of a civilization that had reached remarkable heights of achievement, and that deserved to be remembered and honored for all time. In the quiet darkness, beneath the great mound, surrounded by the symbols of his earthly power and the tokens of his subjects' love, King Rædwald began his final journey not to the afterlife alone, but toward a different kind of immortality that would be achieved when his story was finally told to the modern world. The Bretwalda, who had balanced two faiths in life, had achieved in death a synthesis even more remarkable, the transformation of mortality into legend, of history into myth, of a single remarkable life into one of the greatest stories in all of English history. On a warm summer morning in 1939, as Europe teetered on the brink of its greatest conflict, a quiet revolution in our understanding of the past began in a peaceful corner of Suffolk. The discovery that would unfold over the following months would not only transform archaeological knowledge, but would fundamentally alter how we view the so-called Dark Ages and the sophisticated civilization of early Anglo-Saxon England. The story of this remarkable discovery begins with a curious landowner, a dedicated amateur archaeologist, and a series of ancient mounds that had kept their secrets for more than 13 centuries. Mrs. Edith Pretty, the owner of the Sutton estate, had lived with these mysterious earthen mounds for years, wondering about their origin and significance. Local folklore spoke of ancient burials and buried treasure, but these were often dismissed as mere country tales with little basis in historical fact. The mounds themselves low, grass-covered hills that rose gently from the landscape seemed unremarkable to casual observers, indistinguishable from the natural undulations of the Suffolk countryside except to those who knew what to look for. The decision to investigate these mysterious features was prompted by a combination of intellectual curiosity and practical concerns. Mrs. Pretty had long been interested in the history of her property and the ancient peoples who had once lived there. As international tensions grew and war seemed increasingly inevitable, she felt an urgency about uncovering whatever secrets the mounds might contain before circumstances might make such research impossible. The man she chose to lead this investigation was Basil Brown, a local archaeologist whose reputation for careful, methodical work had earned him the respect of the archaeological community despite his lack of formal academic credentials. Brown possessed the rare combination of theoretical knowledge and practical experience that made him ideally suited for the challenges that lay ahead. His understanding of Anglo-Saxon burial practices, gained through years of fieldwork throughout East Anglia, would prove crucial in recognizing the significance of what was about to be uncovered. The initial excavations in 1938 focused on some of the smaller mounds, which yielded tantalizing hints of the treasures that lay beneath the Suffolk soil. Fragments of decorated metalwork, pieces of corroded iron, and sherds of pottery suggested that these were indeed ancient burial sites, probably dating to the Anglo-Saxon period. But it was clear that earlier excavator treasure hunters and antiquarians of previous centuries had disturbed many of these sites, removing the most valuable objects, while leaving behind only fragments and clues. It was in 1939 that attention turned to the largest mound on the site, Mound 1, as it came to be known, a low hill that had somehow escaped the attention of earlier treasure seekers. Brown's careful excavation techniques, which emphasized recording the position and context of every find rather than simply extracting valuable objects, would prove crucial in unlocking the secrets that lay beneath. The first indication that something extraordinary lay beneath Mound 1 came when Brown's careful excavation revealed a line of iron rivets, lying in the soil exactly where they would have been if they had once held together the planks of a large wooden ship. The implications of this discovery were staggering. The rivets truly marked the position of a buried ship. It would represent one of the most significant archaeological finds in British history. As the excavation progressed with painstaking care, the outline of the ship became increasingly clear. This was no ordinary vessel, but a magnificent craft nearly 90 feet in length, built with a skill and attention to detail that spoke of the highest levels of craftsmanship available in early medieval Europe. The ship had been placed in a specially excavated trench, then covered with a massive mound of earth that had preserved its shape for more than 13 centuries. But it was the discovery of the burial chamber within the ship that truly revealed the magnitude of this find. As Brown and his assistants carefully removed the soil from the center of the vessel, they uncovered a rectangular chamber that had been constructed from wooden planks and filled with grave goods of unimaginable richness and beauty. This was clearly the tomb of someone of extraordinary importance, a king or prince, whose subjects had honored him with a burial that surpassed anything previously known from Anglo-Saxon England. The treasures that emerged from the burial chamber read like an inventory of the finest art and craftsmanship of the early medieval world. Gold and garnet jewelry of exquisite workmanship lay alongside weapons and armor that represented the pinnacle of Anglo-Saxon metal. Silver vessels from the Byzantine Empire spoke of trade connections that spanned the known world, while drinking horns made from the horns of extinct aurochs connected the burial to the ancient hunting traditions of the Germanic peoples. Each object that was uncovered added new dimensions to our understanding of early medieval society. The great gold belt buckle, weighing more than a pound and decorated with intricate animal interlace, demonstrated that Anglo-Saxon craftsmen could work with precious metals at a level of sophistication that rivaled anything produced in the most advanced centers of European civilization. The magnificent helmet, with its bronze panels depicting warriors in combat and its face mask that transformed the wearer into a supernatural being, revealed a conception of kingship that combined practical military leadership with shamanic and religious authority. Perhaps most remarkable of all was the ceremonial whetstone, carved with human faces and topped with a bronze stag, which served not as a functional tool but as a scepter symbolizing royal authority. This object, more than any other, captured the synthesis of practical and symbolic power that characterized Anglo-Saxon kingship at its height. The whetstone spoke of a ruler who was not just a war leader, but a sacred king who served as a bridge between the human and divine worlds. The scientific significance of the Sutton discovery extended far beyond the intrinsic value of the objects themselves. The careful recording of the burial's context and contents provided unprecedented insights into Anglo-Saxon burial practices, social organization, and cultural values. For the first time, archaeologists had access to an undisturbed royal burial that could illuminate the world of early medieval England in ways that written sources could never achieve. The dating evidence provided by coins found in the burial was particularly important. The collection of Frankish gold pieces, each from a different mint and all dating to the early 7th century, provided crucial chronological anchors that allowed the burial to be dated with unusual precision. This evidence pointed to a burial date around 625, during the reign of King Rædwald of East Anglia, exactly the period when historical sources suggest that East Anglia was at the height of its power and influence. The international significance of the finds became apparent as scholars from across Europe and beyond began to study the Sutton assemblage. The burial contained objects from across the known world: Byzantine silver, Frankish gold, Scandinavian amber, and luxury goods from sources as distant as Sri Lanka and the eastern Mediterranean. This was not the tomb of a provincial chieftain, but the burial of a ruler who had participated in the sophisticated international culture of early medieval Europe. The artistic significance of the Sutton finds was equally revolutionary. The intricate garnet cloison work that decorated many of the finest objects demonstrated that Anglo-Saxon craftsmen had achieved levels of technical mastery that had previously been attributed only to Byzantine or Frankish workshops. The distinctive style that characterized these pieces, combining Germanic artistic traditions with influences from across Europe, represented a unique synthesis that was recognizably, lucidly English while being thoroughly international in its sources and inspiration. The religious significance of the burial was complex and fascinating. The presence of clearly Christian objects, including the baptismal spoons, inscribed with the names of St. Paul before and after his conversion, alongside items that connected the burial to traditional Germanic religion, perfectly captured the religious synthesis that historical sources suggest characterized Rædwald's reign. This was not religious confusion, but deliberate accommodation, a sophisticated approach to the spiritual challenges of an age of religious transition. The discovery of Sutton, fundamentally transformed scholarly understanding of the period that had previously been known as the Dark Ages. The notion that the centuries following the end of Roman rule in Britain had been characterized by cultural decline and barbarism could no longer be sustained in the face of evidence for such sophisticated artistic achievement and international connections. The burial revealed a society that was not only civilized, but that had achieved remarkable heights of cultural and political development. The impact of the discovery extended far beyond the academic world. The magnificent objects from Sutton captured the public imagination in ways that few archaeological finds have ever achieved. Here was treasure in the most literal sense, gold and jewels that spoke of wealth and power, beyond anything in contemporary experience. But more than that, these were objects that told stories, artifacts that connected modern audiences to the dramatic world of early medieval England in immediate and visceral ways. The timing of the discovery, on the eve of World War II, added particular poignancy to the story. As Europe prepared for a conflict that would determine the future of civilization, the emergence of these testimonies to past achievement served as powerful reminders of cultural continuity and human resilience. The treasures that had been buried during one period of historical upheaval were being revealed during another, creating connections across the centuries that spoke to fundamental continuities in human experience. The conservation and study of the Sutton finds presented enormous technical challenges. Many of the objects had been severely damaged by their long burial, with metal corroded and organic materials reduced to mere stains in the soil. The painstaking work of reconstruction and conservation that followed the excavation required innovations in archaeological technique that would benefit the entire field of medieval studies. The helmet, in particular, required years of careful work to reconstruct from hundreds of tiny fragments, the achievement of the conservators who pieced together this masterpiece of early medieval art was itself a testament to the dedication and skill that characterizes modern archaeological practice. The resulting reconstruction, while necessarily interpretive in some details, provided the world with one of the most iconic images of Anglo-Saxon culture of face masks that seems to stare across the centuries with the authority and mystery of ancient kingship. The broader implications of the Sutton discovery for our understanding of early English history have continued to unfold over the decades since the original excavation. The burial has provided crucial evidence for reassessing the nature of Anglo-Saxon kingship, the extent of early medieval trade networks, and the sophisticated cultural synthesis that characterized the best achievements of Germanic civilization. In Britain, the archaeological techniques pioneered at Sutton who have influenced excavation methodology throughout the world. The emphasis on careful recording of context, the recognition that information can be as valuable as objects, and the integration of scientific analysis with traditional archaeological interpretation all trace their development to the groundbreaking work undertaken in that Suffolk field in the late 1930s. The site itself has continued to yield new discoveries and insights as archaeological techniques have advanced. Subsequent excavations have revealed additional burial mounds, execution sites, and settlement remains that have provided ever more detailed pictures of life in early medieval East Anglia. Each new discovery has added layers of complexity to our understanding of the society that created the magnificent ship burial. The museum and visitor centre that now occupy the Sutton, whose sites serve not just as repositories for archaeological finds but as centres for ongoing research and public education. The reconstruction of the burial chamber allows visitors to experience something approaching the awe that the original discoverers must have felt as they uncovered the treasures that had lain hidden for so many centuries. The legacy of Sutton, who extends far beyond the immediate contributions to archaeological knowledge. The discovery has inspired countless works of literature, art, and popular culture that have brought the world of early medieval England to life for new generations. The story of the burial has become part of the cultural heritage not just of England but of all peoples who value the preservation and understanding of the human past. Perhaps most importantly, Sutton, who has demonstrated the crucial role that archaeology can play in recovering the stories of peoples and periods that might otherwise remain forever lost. The written sources for early Anglo-Saxon England are fragmentary and limited, but the material evidence preserved in burials like Sutton who provides access to aspects of past experience that no document could ever capture. The ship that was buried beneath the Suffolk mound has completed its final voyage, carrying its royal passenger not to the afterlife, but to a kind of immortality that its creators could never have imagined. The treasures that were intended to serve a king in death have instead served to illuminate the world of the living, providing insights into one of the most remarkable periods in English history, the discovery of Sutton, who stands as one of the great triumphs of archaeological science, a demonstration of what careful, methodical investigation can achieve when combined with luck, persistence, and the wisdom to recognize significance when it appears. The amateur archaeologist who first recognized the meaning of those iron rivets lying in the Suffolk soil had unlocked secrets that would transform our understanding of the past and provide inspiration for future generations of scholars and students. In the end, the greatest treasure discovered at Sutton, who was not gold or garnets, but knowledge understanding of a vanished world that had achieved remarkable heights of cultural development and political sophistication. The burial that was intended to preserve the memory of one remarkable king had instead preserved the memory of an entire civilization, ensuring that the achievements of early Anglo-Saxon England would never again be dismissed as mere barbarism or cultural decline. The story of Sutton, who continues to unfold as new technologies and new questions drive ongoing research. Each generation of scholars brings fresh perspectives and new techniques to the study of these remarkable finds, ensuring that the legacy of King Rædwald and his burial will continue to enrich our understanding of the human past for generations to come. As twilight settles over the ancient landscape of East Anglia, where the River Deben still winds its way toward the North Sea, just as it did 14 centuries ago, the legacy of King Rædwald continues to resonate through the gentle countryside that once witnessed his magnificent reign. The great mound at Sutton, who stands silent now, its secrets revealed to the world, but the influence of the remarkable ruler who was buried beneath it extends far beyond the boundaries of his earthly kingdom and far beyond the span of his mortal life. The immediate aftermath of Rædwald's death in 624 marked the beginning of a new chapter in the complex story of Anglo-Saxon England. The kingdom he had built, the alliances he had forged, and the religious synthesis he had pioneered all faced the ultimate test of survival without their creator. His son Eopold, who inherited the throne, attempted to maintain the delicate balance that his father had achieved, but the challenges proved overwhelming for a ruler who lacked Rædwald's unique combination of military prowess, diplomatic skill, and spiritual authority. The political structure that Rædwald had created as Bretwalda, the network of subordinate kingdoms that acknowledged East Anglian supremacy, proved to be more fragile than it had appeared during his lifetime. Without the personal relationships and hard-won respect that had bound other rulers to Rædwald, the system of alliances began to fracture almost immediately. Edwin of Northumbria, who owed his throne to Rædwald's support, gradually asserted his independence and eventually claimed the position of Bretwalda for himself. Yet the influence of Rædwald's example continued to shape the development of Anglo-Saxon kingship long after his personal power had passed to others. The religious policies he had pioneered, the careful accommodation between Christian and pagan traditions, provided a model that other rulers would follow as they navigated their own spiritual transitions. The notion that effective leadership required synthesis rather than confrontation, that wise rulers could bridge apparently irreconcilable differences, became an enduring element of English political culture that would survive the Anglo-Saxon period itself. The economic prosperity that had characterized East Anglia during Rædwald's reign provided another lasting legacy. The trade networks he had fostered, the diplomatic relationships he had cultivated, and the reputation for security and fair dealing that his kingdom had earned all continued to benefit his successors long after his death. The port of Ipswich, which had grown from a modest coastal settlement to a major international trading centre under his patronage, remained one of England's most important commercial hubs for centuries to come. The artistic traditions that had flourished under generous patronage left an equally enduring mark on English culture. The distinctive style of metalwork and jewellery that had been developed in East Anglian workshops became the standard for luxury goods throughout the Anglo-Saxon world. The techniques of garnet cloison work that had reached their zenith in the treasures buried at Sutton, who influenced craftsmen for generations, while the artistic synthesis of Germanic and Mediterranean traditions that characterized the finest pieces became a hallmark of early English art. Perhaps most importantly, Rædwald's reign had demonstrated that Germanic kingship could achieve levels of sophistication and cultural development that rivaled anything found in the more established civilizations of continental Europe. The notion that the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were merely crude barbarian societies, struggling to emerge from post-Roman chaos, could never again be sustained in the face of evidence for the remarkable achievements that had been possible under wise and capable leadership. The genealogical traditions that traced the descent of later English kings back to Rædwald and his dynasty ensured that his memory was preserved in the official histories of the kingdoms that succeeded East Anglia, even as political power shifted to Mercia, Wessex, and eventually to a unified English kingdom. The prestige associated with the Wulffinga bloodline continued to enhance the legitimacy of rulers who could claim descent from the great Bretwalda. The location of Rædwald's burial became a place of pilgrimage and reverence that lasted for centuries after his death. Travelers would make detours to visit the great mound overlooking the River Deben, drawn by stories of the magnificent king who lay beneath and the treasures that had been buried with him. These visits helped to maintain East Anglia's reputation as a land where great deeds had been accomplished and where the memory of heroic achievement was properly honored. The influence of Rædwald's religious synthesis extended far beyond the borders of his own kingdom and far beyond his own lifetime. The principle that Christianity and traditional Germanic beliefs could coexist during periods of transition became an important element in the peaceful conversion of Scandinavian kingdoms during the Viking Age. Missionaries who had studied the East Anglian example were better equipped to work with rulers who faced similar challenges in managing the spiritual needs of diverse populations. The legal and administrative innovations that had been developed during Rædwald's reign provided models that were adopted and adapted by later Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. His approach to taxation, his methods of dispute resolution, and his techniques for managing the complex relationships between different social groups all influenced the development of English law and governance in ways that would persist long after the Norman conquest. The international reputation that Rædwald had earned through his diplomatic skill and military success continued to benefit England's position in European affairs for generations. Foreign rulers who had dealt with the East Anglian king carried away impressions of Anglo-Saxon sophistication and capability that shaped their subsequent relationships with English kingdoms. The demonstration that Germanic rulers could be effective partners in international affairs opened doors that might otherwise have remained closed. The scholarly tradition that had been encouraged at Rædwald's court provided crucial links in the transmission of learning between the ancient world and the medieval period. The manuscripts that had been preserved in East Anglian monasteries and royal libraries, the scholarly networks that had been established through royal patronage, and the intellectual synthesis of Germanic and Mediterranean traditions that had been fostered under royal protection all contributed to the preservation and development of knowledge. During a crucial period in European history, the archaeological legacy of Rædwald's reign extends far beyond the spectacular burial at Sutton. The material culture that developed under his patronage, the pottery styles, metalworking techniques, architectural innovations, and artistic traditions provides modern scholars with unprecedented insights into the daily life and cultural achievements of early Anglo-Saxon England. Every excavation in East Anglia continues to reveal evidence of the prosperity and sophistication that characterized the region during its golden age. The influence of Rædwald's example on later concepts of English kingship was profound and lasting. The notion that effective rulers must balance competing interests, that successful leadership requires both military prowess and diplomatic skill, and that true greatness comes from serving something larger than oneself, all became enduring elements of English political thought. Even monarchs who ruled centuries after Rædwald's death would be judged by standards that he had helped to establish. The cultural memory of Rædwald's achievements became embedded in the oral traditions and literary works that shaped English identity for centuries to come. The poems and stories that celebrated his deeds, the genealogies that traced later heroes back to his dynasty, and the legends that grew up around his burial all contributed to a cultural narrative that emphasized the possibility of achieving greatness through wisdom, courage, and moral authority. The geographic legacy of Rædwald's reign can still be traced in the landscape of modern East Anglia. Archaeological surveys continue to reveal the extent of the settlement network that developed under his rule, while place name studies demonstrate the lasting influence of the population movements and administrative arrangements that characterized his kingdom. The very names of towns and villages throughout the region preserve echoes of the world that flourished under his leadership. The technological innovations that were fostered during Rædwald's reign had implications that extended far beyond his own kingdom and time period. The shipbuilding techniques that produced the magnificent vessel buried at Sutton, the metalworking skills that created the treasures found in the burial, and the agricultural improvements that supported the kingdom's prosperity all contributed to the broader development of English civilization. The diplomatic precedents established during Rædwald's reign as Bretwalda provided models for later attempts to create unified leadership among the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. The techniques he had developed for managing relationships between independent but allied rulers, the protocols he had established for resolving disputes without warfare, and the mechanisms he had created for coordinating common interests all influenced subsequent efforts to achieve political unity in England. The educational traditions that flourished under Rædwald's patronage helped to preserve and transmit the learning of both classical antiquity and Germanic tradition to future generations. The schools that were established under royal protection, the libraries that were accumulated through royal patronage, and the scholarly networks that were fostered through royal support all played crucial roles in maintaining cultural continuity. During a period of rapid change, the artistic synthesis that reached its pinnacle during Rædwald's reign provided a foundation for the later development of distinctively English forms of cultural expression. The fusion of Germanic, Celtic, and Mediterranean influences that characterized the finest works of art produced under his patronage established aesthetic principles that would continue to influence English artists and craftsmen for centuries to come. The military innovations that were developed during Rædwald's campaigns provided models that influenced Anglo-Saxon warfare for generations. His techniques for coordinating large coalitions, his methods for integrating different types of warriors into effective fighting forces, and his strategies for projecting power beyond his kingdom's immediate borders all became standard elements of Anglo-Saxon military practice. The economic policies that produced such remarkable prosperity during Rædwald's reign provided lessons that were studied and emulated by later rulers throughout medieval Europe. His approach to encouraging trade, his methods for managing royal finances, and his techniques for fostering economic development all became models for effective governance that transcended the specific circumstances of early 7th England. The religious legacy of Rædwald's unique approach to spiritual leadership continued to influence English Christianity long after his death. The principle that effective religious leadership required understanding and accommodation rather than confrontation and coercion became an important element in the development of the English Church. The tradition of tolerance and synthesis that he had pioneered helped to create a distinctively English form of Christianity that was both thoroughly orthodox and remarkably inclusive. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the mist rises from the River Deben and settles gently over the landscape of Suffolk, there is a sense that the past is never truly past, that the great deeds and profound achievements of those who came before us continue to shape the world in ways both visible and hidden. The story of King Rædwald, the East Anglian overlord, who balanced two faiths and united kingdoms under his wise rule, is more than just a tale from the distant past. It is a reminder of the timeless qualities that define true greatness and the enduring power of wisdom, courage, and moral authority. The modern rediscovery of Rædwald's story through the magnificent archaeological finds at Sutton, who has provided us with a window into a world that seemed lost forever, civilization that achieved remarkable heights of cultural development and political sophistication during what historians once dismissively called the Dark Ages. The treasures that were buried with the great king have told us stories that no written chronicle could ever capture, revealing the intricate details of daily life, the complex networks of international trade and diplomacy, and the sophisticated artistic traditions that flourished in early Anglo-Saxon England. The helmet that protected Rædwald's head in battle and ceremony has become one of the most iconic images of early English history. Its bronze and iron face mask staring across the centuries with an expression that seems to embody both the fierce warrior traditions of the Germanic peoples and the sophisticated cultural synthesis that characterized the best achievements of Anglo-Saxon civilization. The golden belt buckle that symbolized his royal authority continues to dazzle viewers with its intricate animal interlace, while the ceremonial whetstone that served as his scepter reminds us of a time when kingship was understood to be a sacred trust that connected the earthly and divine realms. The silver bowls and dishes that came from the distant Byzantine Empire speak of a world that was far more connected and cosmopolitan than we might have imagined, while the drinking horns made from the great aurochs connect us to the ancient hunting traditions and warrior culture that shaped the Germanic peoples for countless generations. Every object in the burial tells part of a larger story about a ruler who successfully navigated the complex challenges of leadership in an age of profound transformation. The religious synthesis that Rædwald pioneered, the remarkable accommodation between Christian and pagan traditions that allowed him to maintain altars to both Christ and the ancient gods in his royal hall, provides lessons that remain relevant in our own age of religious and cultural diversity. His demonstration that apparent contradictions could be resolved through wisdom and tolerance, that competing beliefs could coexist when guided by principled leadership, offers hope for those who struggle with similar challenges in the modern world. The political achievements of Rædwald's reign provide equally valuable lessons for contemporary leaders. His rise from regional king to Bretwalda, the overlord whose authority was acknowledged throughout southern England, was accomplished not through naked aggression or brutal conquest, but through a careful combination of military prowess, diplomatic skill, and moral authority. He understood that lasting power could not be maintained through fear and intimidation, but required the willing cooperation of those who were governed. The Battle of the River Idle, where Rædwald risked everything to protect a guest who had sought sanctuary in his hall, stands as one of the great examples of principled leadership in the face of overwhelming odds. His willingness to honor the ancient laws of hospitality, even when faced with threats from the most powerful military force in northern England, demonstrated that there are some values that transcend immediate political advantage. The victory that followed proved that moral courage could be rewarded even in the harsh world of early medieval politics. The economic prosperity that characterized East Anglia during Rædwald's reign provides evidence of what could be accomplished when wise governance created conditions for trade and cultural exchange to flourish. The kingdom's position as a center of international commerce, the sophisticated craftsmanship that developed under royal patronage, and the diplomatic networks that connected East Anglia to courts throughout Europe all demonstrate the benefits that flow from leadership that prioritizes the common good over narrow self-interest. The cultural flowering that took place under Rædwald's rule reminds us of the crucial role that enlightened patronage can play in fostering artistic achievement and intellectual development. The workshops that produced some of the finest metalwork in medieval Europe, the court that attracted poets and scholars from across the known world, and the libraries that preserved the learning of both classical antiquity and Germanic tradition, All flourished because they had a ruler who understood that cultural development was as important as military success or economic prosperity. The burial itself, that magnificent ship filled with treasures from across the known world, represents one of the most remarkable attempts in human history to preserve memory and honor achievement for future generations. The anonymous craftsmen and advisors who planned this extraordinary ceremony understood that they were creating more than just a tomb. They were constructing a monument to the possibility of human greatness that would speak to people across the centuries about what could be accomplished through wisdom, courage, and dedication to principles larger than oneself. The archaeological discovery of this burial in 1939 came at a moment when the world desperately needed reminders of cultural continuity and human achievement. As Europe prepared for a conflict that would test the very foundations of civilization, the emergence of these treasures from the Suffolk soil provided powerful evidence that darkness and barbarism need not be the final word in human affairs. The fact that such remarkable achievements had been possible during what was once considered a period of decline offered hope that contemporary challenges could also be overcome through wisdom and determination. The ongoing scholarly study of the Sutton who finds continues to reveal new insights into the sophisticated civilization that Rædwald helped to create. Each new analysis of the burial goods, each new interpretation of their symbolic meaning, and each new discovery in the broader landscape around the burial site adds layers of complexity to our understanding of what was accomplished during this remarkable period in English history. The influence of Rædwald's example on subsequent English history has been profound and lasting, even when it has not been explicitly recognized. The tradition of religious tolerance that has characterized much of English history, the preference for gradual accommodation over sudden transformation that has marked many periods of English political development, and the understanding that effective leadership requires moral authority as well as political power, all trace their origins back to precedents established during his reign. The international reputation that England has enjoyed as a place where different traditions could be synthesized and where innovation could flourish, alongside respect for ancient wisdom, owes much to the example set by rulers like Rædwald, who demonstrated that such synthesis was possible. The notion that English civilization represented a unique blend of Germanic warrior culture, Celtic artistic tradition, Roman administrative skill, and Christian spiritual insight all found early expression in the achievements of the East Anglian court. The literary traditions that have shaped English culture for more than a millennium preserve echoes of the world that flourished under Rædwald's rule. The poems that celebrate heroic achievement, the stories that explore the tension between loyalty and principle, and the chronicles that preserve the memory of wise rulers all draw upon traditions that were first given full expression during the Golden Age of East Anglia. Modern visitors to the Sutton site can still sense something of the awe and wonder that must have accompanied the original burial ceremony. The reconstructed burial chamber allows us to imagine the solemnity and magnificence of that final tribute to a great king, while the museum displays help us to understand the sophisticated culture that produced such remarkable artistic achievements. Standing on the hill overlooking the River Deben, watching the same tides that once carried ships laden with treasures from across the known world, one can almost hear the echoes of a vanished age when heroes walked the earth and great deeds were honored with appropriate ceremony. The landscape itself preserves memories of Rædwald's time in ways both obvious and subtle. The river that provided the highway for international trade still winds its way toward the North Sea, while the fields that once supported the prosperous settlements of his kingdom continue to yield archaeological evidence of their former glory. Ancient field boundaries, traces of forgotten roads, and the foundations of buildings that once housed craftsmen and merchants all contribute to our understanding of what life was like during this remarkable period. The place names that dot the East Anglian countryside preserve linguistic evidence of the population movements and administrative arrangements that characterized Rædwald's kingdom. Elements of Old English, traces of Celtic influence, and hints of Scandinavian connection all survive in the names of towns and villages that have existed continuously since the early medieval period. These humble survivals often provide insights into the past that are as valuable as the most spectacular archaeological discoveries. The genetic studies that are beginning to reveal the ancestry of modern English populations also preserve traces of the world that Rædwald knew. The DNA of people living in East Anglia today reflects the complex mixture of populations that came together during the Anglo-Saxon period, while the distribution of particular genetic markers provides evidence for the settlement patterns and population movements that shaped the early English kingdoms. The influence of Rædwald's example extends beyond England to encompass the broader development of Northern European civilization. His demonstration that Germanic rulers could achieve levels of sophistication that rivaled the achievements of the Roman Empire provided inspiration for other leaders throughout Scandinavia and northern Germany. The religious synthesis he pioneered influenced the peaceful conversion of Denmark and Norway, while the artistic traditions that flourished under his patronage spread throughout the Germanic world. The modern nation that has grown from the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms that Rædwald helped to shape continues to grapple with many of the same challenges that he faced: how to balance competing interests, how to maintain unity while respecting diversity, how to preserve valuable traditions while adapting to changing circumstances. His example suggests that such challenges can be met successfully when leaders possess the wisdom to see beyond immediate advantages to larger principles and the courage to act upon their convictions even in the face of overwhelming opposition. The story of Rædwald's life and achievements offers hope in an age that often seems dominated by cynicism and narrow self. His demonstration that political power could be exercised with moral authority, that different traditions could be synthesized rather than forced into conflict, and that lasting greatness came from service to something larger than oneself, provides a model that remains relevant across the centuries. The peaceful sleep that now enfolds the great mound at Sutton, who is not the sleep of death and forgetfulness, but the rest that comes to those who have completed their appointed tasks and left the world better than they found it. The king who was buried beneath that hill with such magnificent ceremony achieved through his life and death a form of immortality that no amount of gold or precious stones could purchase, the immortality that comes from inspiring others to strive for excellence and from demonstrating that human beings are capable of remarkable achievements when they are guided by wisdom, courage, and moral purpose. As we reach the end of this long journey through the life and times of King Rædwald, we are left not with a sense of ending, but with an appreciation for the continuing relevance of his example. The challenges he faced, the solutions he developed, and the achievements he accomplished all speak to timeless aspects of the human condition that transcend the specific circumstances of early 7th century England. The treasures that were buried with him at Sutton, who were intended to serve him in the afterlife, but they have instead served to illuminate our understanding of the past and to inspire our hopes for the future. The ship that carried him to his final rest has completed a voyage that none of its builders could have imagined, a journey not just through death, but through time itself, carrying its precious cargo of memory and meaning to generations of people who have found in his story confirmation of their own highest aspirations. In the gentle Suffolk countryside, where Rædwald once ruled, the seasons continue to turn, as they have for countless centuries. Spring brings new life to fields that once supported his prosperous kingdom. Summer fills the air with the songs of birds that are descendants of those that once nested in the royal forests. Autumn paints the landscape in colours that would have been familiar to the king and his court, and winter brings the peace and rest that allow the land to gather strength for the cycles of renewal that lie ahead. The river Devon still flows toward the sea, carrying on its waters the reflections of clouds that drift across the same sky that once witnessed the magnificent burial of the East Anglian Overlord. Ships still sail these waters, though they are very different from the vessels that once brought treasures from across the known world to fill the royal treasury. Yet the connection between past and present remains unbroken, a reminder that we are all part of a continuing story that began long before our birth and will continue long after our own contribution has been made. The story of King Rædwald, the overlord who balanced two faiths and was buried like a king of kings, comes to its end not with the finality of death, but with the promise of continuing influence and inspiration. His legacy lives on in the institutions he helped to create, the traditions he helped to establish, the artistic achievements he helped to foster, and the example he provided of what could be accomplished through wise and principled leadership. As the last light of day fades over the ancient landscape of East Anglia, as the evening mist begins to rise from the waters of the Devon, and as the peaceful darkness of another night settles over the great mound at Sutton who we can rest in, the knowledge that some achievements transcend the limitations of mortality. The king who was buried beneath that hill with such magnificent ceremony continues to rule over the realm of memory and imagination, inspiring new generations of people to strive for the excellence that he achieved and to hope for the wisdom that he demonstrated in the quiet hours before sleep claims us. We can take comfort in the knowledge that the human spirit is capable of remarkable achievements when guided by noble purposes and sustained by unshakable convictions. The story of Rædwald reminds us that darkness and chaos need not have the final word, that wisdom and courage can triumph over seemingly impossible odds, and that the pursuit of excellence in all its forms remains one of the highest callings of human existence. Sleep well, gentle listener, secure in the knowledge that the values Rædwald represented: donor, wisdom, courage, and service to something greater than oneself continue to light the way for all who seek to make their own contribution to the great story of human achievement. May your dreams be filled with visions of golden halls and heroic deeds, of wise kings and faithful servants, of a time when the world was young and great things seemed possible for those who possessed the vision to see them and the determination to make them real. The East Anglian Overlord sleeps beneath his great mound, surrounded by the treasures that proclaimed his earthly glory. But his true legacy lives on in the hearts and minds of all who have been inspired by his example. In honoring his memory, we honor the best possibilities of our own nature and affirm our faith in the continuing human capacity for wisdom, courage, and moral greatness. Rest now in the peace that comes to those who have heard great stories and been reminded of great truths. The tale of Rædwald, the king of two faiths, who was buried like a king of kings, will continue to echo through the centuries, carrying its message of hope and inspiration to all who have ears to hear and hearts to understand. Sleep and dream of better worlds made possible by the examples of those who came before us, and wake tomorrow ready to add your own chapter to the continuing story of human achievement and aspiration. May the memory of King Rædwald of East Anglia, the Bretwalda, who balanced two worlds and was buried like a king of kings, bring you peaceful dreams and inspire your waking hours. Sleep well, dear listener, until history calls us together once again. Sleepy Crown.